Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Excellent. So, yes, today we are finally going to do this year's update for our series, Dinosaurs, the second chapter. So, this is our series on the evolution of modern type birds. So, yeah, quite a lot has happened in bird paleontology recently. But before we go over there, how have you been doing? It's been a while since we recorded anything, really.
Yeah, it's been a couple of weeks at least. But things have certainly been good on my end. Um, as I've been keeping everyone here updated on the new house that
Mm.
we've been building with the folks. Um, I can honestly say we've been making some very serious progress these last couple of weeks. Um, Much of the interior is finished in terms of like the main structures, and the outside is slowly getting finished. We're having the siding put in, and so now for the most part, it's all cosmetic stuff. Paint and wallpaper if we want to have that. So I'm finally like excited. I'm looking forward to seeing this thing completed after my goodness, what has been at least over 2 years of work.
Wow.
And like I have never been as intimate in watching a house construction
Mm.
as now. 'Cause, I mean, like the last home that we lived in, it was a standard suburban planning kind of thing. Construction people come in, you pick what house parts you want, and they just put it all together. And we never really kept up with that. I think maybe my dad went to the construction site twice the entire time the house was being
Mm.
made. But like we've been not only like in like looking at, but also involved in this construction from the beginning at every single stage. Like I've given an extra hand because my folks can only do so much,
Mm.
and we've done yard work and things in the house, sweeping up that sort of thing. Um, but like, yeah, we're getting there, and it's really exciting to see. Um, but like otherwise, things have been pretty good on my end. I've been working on show stuff slowly, a little bit more slowly than I would like, but it is the winter time.
Mm.
Well, wintertime is approaching, I should say. It's not technically winter yet, but I mean, like, I've also been kind of getting into the flow of that with the folks,
Yeah.
and I'll probably be on a big vacation here soon.
Mm. Mm.
So my work on this web series will probably shorten even more. Um, but I have no less been keeping up with updates in the world of paleoanthropology and biology, and also pop culture as well, of
Mm.
course. I think two of the most anticipated things in terms of people who might be interested in our show um, I have been looking forward to is Disney's Strange World, their latest film from Walt Disney Animation Studios, which plays a lot with spec biology.
Mm.
If you have ever seen the trailers, I got to see that last week, and I was really impressed. I was very pleased with the film. It's a very good film, and I think that some of the unfortunate controversy that's been associated with it, as well as the poor box office, should not detract from the film itself. I think it should still be given a worthy watch. And thankfully, like if you are not in the mood for a theater experience, I think by the end of the month it's going to be on Disney Plus for people who subscribe, so you'll be able to check it out there. Um, but I quite really enjoyed that. A lot of surprises in terms of the spec biology in that film that I think will leave many of our audience pleasantly surprised
Mm.
at the outcome of the film. And of course, Avatar: The Way of Water, which
Mm.
is another spec bio project
Yeah.
that um, we've all been anticipating. I think if not so much for the characters or the story, but for the creatures in the
Mm.
world. Because in this one, as the title suggests, we're going to be exploring aquatic environments and seeing like what Pandoran um, ocean life is like. And given what we saw in the first film with its land creatures, some designs that we all enjoyed, some that were a little bit lackluster, I'm sure we're going to be in for some real treats coming here.
Mm.
I mean, even just based on some of the trailers that we've gotten already. Um, but we definitely don't have long till that film. As of the time of recording, on the 16th of December is the official release. It's supposed to be a 3-hour film too, so make sure you go to the bathroom beforehand and you have all your snacks ready.
Yeah, like you do
Um,
before you watch one of our episodes, probably.
exactly. Yeah. Oh, but no, I'm sure it's going to be a great experience, and I mean, I do like the franchise. I will admit. I know there's a little bit of back and forth about this among film people and whatnot, but I do like the films. There's certainly something to bond with my folks because they
Hmm.
like the films too. So we're definitely going to probably like watch the original film again before we go and see this one, and we'll make a big day out of it. But yeah, that's pretty much all on my end. Albert, I understand you've been up to some really cool stuff as of late.
I suppose you could say that. I've definitely been busy. Um, so yeah, let me try and think what were some of the major events that happened since the last time we recorded. Well, first of all, in-person conferencing is back. So this past month or so, I've been attending a few in-person gatherings for I was technically not the first time in a long while because I did go to a small conference over the summer, but definitely a return to in-person conferencing for some of these recurring events. So one of these was the annual Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting, one of the biggest conferences in our field. And this year, after 2 years of online conferencing, it's back for an in-person event. It happened in Toronto in early November. That was fun. I gave a talk, and so did several of my lab mates. Um, and another major event that I attended recently, just this past weekend actually, as of the time of recording, was TetZooCon, which is a zoological convention, probably the only of its kind, really, organized by paleontologist Darren Naish. Um, and that was a lot of fun too. And it too had gone through like 2 years of virtual conferencing during the pandemic. Um, but they decided to do an in-person one this year again, and that was also great fun. Um, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what happened at SVP or TetZooCon because we'd be here for a while if I did. So I would just direct you all to go read my blog posts that I wrote up reporting on what I experienced at those events. Now, actually, as of the time recording, I have not finished writing the post for TetZooCon. I have for SVP, it is up. But I think by the time this episode actually goes up, I will probably be finished with the TetZooCon one. So I will definitely add links to both of those in the comments below. That being said, online conferencing has not gone away completely. SVP actually had a sort of a parallel kind of virtual platform at the same time that the in-person conference was happening. But not only that, but I also attended uh, a completely online conference. This is called the Global Nightjar Network Conference. It was a conference for people who study a group of nocturnal birds called nightjars. And also people who are just interested in that group of birds in general. So there were all kinds of talks from researchers all around the world on what they study regarding nightjar biology. So I got to give a talk about the fossil record of nightjars, which I think, at least I got the impression that a lot of people found interesting because that's not something that people who study modern nightjars tend to think about very much. And in fact, until recently, as you might know if you followed our series, we knew very little about the nightjar fossil record. But that is starting to change. So I hope I gave a pretty interesting talk. I've heard that the talks will eventually be posted online, but I'm not sure what the status on that is, so we'll see. And finally, I also was interviewed by science communicator John Perry. If you haven't checked out his work, it is quite brilliant. He has a couple of YouTube channels, but his kind of main one where he posts like most his quality work is called Stated Clearly, and he posts these short animations explaining concepts relating to biology, especially evolution, and they are really good. Like they are excellent explanations of all these different concepts. I've definitely seen them used in like school settings. People recommend these videos as resources for students, and they're great. But John Perry also has a second channel called Stated Casually, which is kind of, you can kind of tell the difference between them, where he kind of hosts often longer and more casual conversations with various people he invites to come onto his channel. So these include scientists, but also other people as well. But usually all talking about topics relating to evolutionary biology. And over the summer, he saw you might recall this, the cartoon bird phylogeny I drew. And he said, hey, would you be interested in coming onto my channel to speak? And I was like, oh, that sounds like fun. So we ended up arranging a time. And so, yeah, he ended up interviewing me about, what I study, what bird phylogeny is all about, what are some of the major questions in bird phylogeny, and some, various topics relating to bird evolution. He hosted this as a live event on his channel. So while we were doing the interview, there were audience members who would chime in and ask us questions. And so I answered a number of questions about bird evolution. So yeah, that sounds up your alley. And if you're not tired of hearing my voice on this show, then you can go check that out. I'll definitely post a link in the description below. But just to keep it short, I think those are the main events that are worth mentioning on my end of things. Do you have anything else to add before we go on?
Not a whole lot. I did watch your Stated Clearly video, and I thought it was quite nice. It was kind of cool to see you kind of go over many of the topics that we've covered on this show. Nice, good overview of bird origins and phylogeny. And also just a great chance to see your massive bird tree featured again in a more public space that people could admire. It's still an amazing piece. I still need to get myself together and get a physical copy from you, and so I can put that on my wall, which will probably be like oversaturated with posters. Oh goodness gracious! But no, I'm really happy for it, and all that sounds amazing. I definitely kept up with SVP and with Tetsucon a little bit. I was actually just telling you that not too long ago that I had almost forgotten like when Tetsucon was supposed to happen. So like my news of it was very spontaneous.
Right.
Like I woke up and it was a normal day, and I checked my social medias, and oh hey, Tetsucon is now. And I immediately began to just see what was going on, and that looks like a lot of fun. I definitely miss not being there, quote unquote, because they didn't have the online version. But
Right.
I'm sure it's all good. I'm sure someday I'll be back again in some way, hopefully. But yeah, no, we definitely got a nice episode coming up for all of y'all who have followed Albert's Dinosaurs, the second chapter closely. Wouldn't you agree?
I hope so, yeah. There have been a lot of interesting developments in bird paleontology over the past year. And similar to Joan's update of her series, Humanity, a Prologue, I definitely had to kind of cut out some stories that I had originally planned to include because there were just so many. But hopefully this is still a decent highlights reel as to what has changed since we last did an update of the series. So should we go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so let's head on to the next slide. So I guess as a preface, before we even go into the individual episodes, I should announce that a new book on fossil birds has come out in the past year. This is the second edition of Gerald Mayr's Paleogene Fossil Birds. Now, surprisingly, because I went back to check, like I remember at the end of the original series, I had like book recommendations for people who are interested in the evolution of modern birds. And I don't think I mentioned the first edition of Paleogene Fossil Birds. I instead mentioned his newer book at the time, Avian Evolution, which came out in 2017. Partly, I imagine that's because the first edition of Paleogene Fossil Birds came out in 2009, so that's definitely quite a while ago, over a decade ago. And so it seemed that for most intents and purposes, avian evolution was more up to date, even though it did not necessarily go into as much detail about the individual fossil bird species as Paleogene Fossil Birds. And kind of related to that is that Paleogene Fossil Birds is a bit more of a technical work than avian evolution. I mean, don't get me wrong, like avian evolution, it's still directed at people who are, pretty deep into paleontology. Like you would definitely be someone who is, at least somewhat interested in the technical aspects of paleo to kind of get a copy of Avian Evolution. But like Paleogene fossil birds really is like a sort of academic directed work. And so it goes into like a fair amount of detail about like individual species of Paleogene fossil birds and what we currently think they are, where they're found, things like that. And since it had been over a decade since the last edition, it certainly was well past time for a new one. So I was very glad to see this come out. And in many ways, it's definitely an improvement over the previous edition. First of all, like pretty much all the photos are in color, so that's really cool. And of course, it's updated with a bunch of like new information that's come out since then. There's even quite a bit of coverage of specimens that are undescribed, and like a lot of these specimens are not even just mentioned in the text, but there are actually photographs of these had not been formally described in the scientific literature. So that's a really tantalizing kind of hint of things to come. And I know Gerald Mayr has been working quite hard, as we shall see in this episode, on describing many of those specimens. So some of the undescribed specimens that are mentioned in this book actually have, like, since the book came out, been described in the past year or so. So that's pretty neat. But yeah, definitely chock full of information. If you need a technical reference on Paleogene fossil birds, then this is kind of the go-to. I will say, and I've actually been meaning to write a review of this book on my blog, but I just have not had the time. I will say there are a few details here and there that seemingly have not been updated, even though relevant information has come out that would warrant that. And I'm sure those are just like oversights because when you're updating a huge technical work like this, it's almost inevitable you'll miss stuff. So I mean I don't think that's a major kind of flaw of the book. It's just something worth keeping in mind. Yeah, there are a few places I noticed where it's like, oh, you could have cited that paper, or like that has kind of changed since then. But no, I mean overall, like this is sort of an indispensable work for those of us who work on this topic. So yeah, check it out if you are as into Paleogene fossil birds as we are. I would say like in many of his books, Gerald Mayr also includes a lot of like kind of his personal ideas about these birds that haven't necessarily been mentioned in scientific literature before. So there are all kinds of like interesting tidbits in here, like where he makes like interesting suggestions about the evolution or ecology of these birds. And so I think even just for that, it's a really interesting piece of work. I won't go into all the details about like all of his different hypotheses that he suggests in here, but I think it's definitely a book worth checking out if you're interested in kind of his latest thinking on a lot of these topics. Okay, so yeah, I think that's most of what I have to say about this book. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I definitely tend to gravitate more towards academic books as I age. I always appreciate a good introductory text, especially when it comes to a subject that I need brushing up on. But like I tend to gravitate towards like more reference works. So like something like Paleogene fossil birds looks like something that I would enjoy flipping through and reading, especially as a reference.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it would be fun also to just take that and the first edition
Yes.
and like do like a side by side kind of thing to see
yeah.
just how much certain fields have changed.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some great surprises in that itself. I would think.
Right. I think you would be correct. So I guess next we can go into kind of updates to individual episodes for the series. And so we are going to start with not the first episode, but the second episode, where we looked at the paleognate birds, so the ostriches and their kin. Nowadays, most of them are flightless, but they also, that's not technically true by species count, but a lot of them are flightless. However, they also include a flying group called the tinamous. And so some of the notable publications that have come out regarding the fossil record of this group are kind of pictured as screenshots on here. So both of these are review papers. The one on the left, the evolution and fossil record of paleognathous birds, was actually written by one of my lab mates, Clara, who is doing her PhD on the evolution of paleognaths. So this was kind of one of the chapters from her PhD was just to review like all the information out there on the paleognath fossil record. So if you're interested in that subject, that is definitely a nice up-to-date reference to check out. And the second review paper that's pictured on here is more specific. It is an overview of the South American and Antarctic fossils, or potential fossils, I should say, of rheas and possible paleognaths from that region, other possible paleognaths. And they also kind of provide some updated interpretations of some of these specimens that have been suggested to be members of this group. Review papers, I'm sure we've talked about this before, but review papers are pretty great if you want like a basic, like broad overview of what has happened in a particular field of scientific study. And like, on this show, I can talk for hours and hours about stuff, as you are well familiar with, but even then, in a format like this, I still would not be able to go into the same amount of detail as like a review paper would be able to, because it's written in text. It's just inherently easier to pack a lot of information into a medium like that. Do you have anything to add before we go on?
Not really, but I always appreciate good reviews.
Yeah, I figured you would. So now let's go on to some actual updates to the science. So here's something that I'm going to return to kind of several times during this update special, because earlier this year, a new paper came out actually coining a bunch of names for bird groups that we previously did not have names for. And so now this paper by George Sangster and colleagues has coined a new name for the clade uniting the moa and the tinamous. And we spoke about this in the episode, but this is a very surprising relationship that was recovered by genetic studies. It turns out that the recently extinct moa of New Zealand are actually not closely related to the other New Zealand group of paleognaths, the kiwi, but instead more closely related to the tinamous, which are still flight capable and only live in South America today. So, very curious relationship. The authors of this new paper have decided to coin a name for this group because it is now very well supported, and so they chose the name Dinocrypturi, and this is one of those names where they basically combine the names of the two different groups together. So the big moa are members of the genus Dinornis, and the moa group in general is called Dinornithiformes, so that's where the dino comes from. And Crypturi comes from an old name for the tinamou group, Crypturi. One of them is still the genus Cryptorellus, even though the group in general nowadays is called the Tinamiformes. And so they combine the names from Dinornis and Cryptorellus to become Dinocrypturi, and so this is now the clade uniting moa and tinamous. Something that surprised me is that when I went back to check what I talked about in the actual episode about paleognaths, I don't think I actually mentioned the names of like a lot of these big clades of paleognaths, probably in the interest of saving time. So I guess just to kind of make up for that here, I'll briefly mention that the clade uniting the kiwi, elephant birds, and passeriforms are the cassowaries and the emu, is called a nova ratite. So nove means basically new, and ratites are the flightless paleognaths, which are not a clade, as you can see here. But a nove ratite kind of is a reference to the fact that members of this group are found in New Zealand, New Guinea, and Australia, which used to be called New Holland. So, all these places with the name new, or with the word new in them. So that's why it's called Nove Ratite. I think at the time this was named, we did not know the elephant birds were members of this group, so they kind of bucked the trend. They're from Madagascar. So that's where that comes from. And the group containing all the paleognaths except for the ostriches is called Noto-Paleognathai, the southern paleognaths. And that's because ostriches actually have a really good fossil record, kind of in Eurasia as well. Even though they're found in Africa today, they haven't always been strictly tied to Africa, to the southern hemisphere. But the other members of the group are mainly found in the southern hemisphere. So Noto-Paleognathai, that's where it comes from. The new name here is Dinocrypturi, the moa and tinamou group. So that's sort of a bookkeeping thing, but people like knowing about names. At least some people do. So should we go on to the next slide?
Sure.
All right. Now, the next slide is not so much about naming things. Putting names on clades is more of a formality than anything, and not so much something that changes the underlying science. But our next story is about kind of what are the actual relationships between these groups of paleognaths, about paleognathe phylogeny. So you may or may not recall this, but back when I was covering paleognathe phylogeny, for this original series of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, I said that there was some controversy over the position of the rheas versus the Moa and Tinamou clade, which we can now call Dinocrypturi. And at the time, I said that it was unclear if the rheas were more distantly related to the remaining paleognaths or the Dinocrypturans were. And I believe at the time I said that there was a recent study, again, at the time, that came out and said that it was more likely that the Moa and Tinamous were more distantly related to the rest versus the rheas. And so that was kind of what I went with when I did the episode. However, a new study has come out since then questioning those conclusions, as these things tend to be. So this new study basically reran the genetic data set that the previous study used, and they made a bunch of modifications, basically trying to test for potential artifacts in the analysis, things that might influence the results, but aren't actually reflective of the true phylogenetic relationships. And it's a pretty complex paper, and they tried a lot of different things. But long story short is that they found that it is actually quite likely that the conclusions of the previous paper were the result of an artifact, and instead it is actually the rheas being more distantly related that is more likely to be the true kind of topology. And this particular figure here actually shows one of the things that they tried, which was basically in the original study, a chicken was used as the outgroup. The outgroup is basically, when you're studying phylogeny, it's an organism that you're pretty sure is not a member of the group you're interested in. So like this study is about paleognathe phylogeny. We're pretty sure that the chicken is not a paleognathe, so we kind of include it as a sort of comparison for the analysis. So potentially, this is a close relative or something representing the ancestral state, and it's something that gives the analysis a point of comparison so we can figure out what the relationships within the main group of interest are. But sometimes your choice of outgroup can really influence your results in a phylogenetic analysis, and that's what the authors here argue, is that they suggest that the chicken is on such a, what we call a long branch, and that means that a bunch of changes have happened along the chicken lineage here. It's actually affecting like the topology within the paleognaths in a way that's not actually reflective of the true relationships. There's a phenomenon that we call long branch attraction, and that is where basically two lineages have changed so much from each other that kind of any subsequent change that happens along those lineages is going to lead analyses to think that they are more similar than they actually are. This is a big problem in phylogenetic analyses. It's something we have to deal with, and so they suggest that one of the reasons that the previous authors got their results was because the long branch of the chicken was kind of pulling the Moa and Tinamou kind of out of that group, and it's kind of pulling them kind of quote unquote further down the tree, so to speak. So they suggest that one of the reasons they got the result was because of the influence of the chicken as an outgroup, and they found that if you remove the chicken, then you instead get the rheas as being more distantly related to the rest. So that's basically what this figure is showing here. So yeah, paleognathe phylogeny is still complicated, and on the next slide I kind of show this, the paleognathe phylogeny again. So yeah, it turns out that it is still a debate whether the rheas or the Moa and Tinamou are closer to the Nova Ratites. And so here I've kind of chosen to depict them as a polytomy, where we're not sure of the relationships between these three different lineages. We're still pretty sure that the ostriches are outside of the rest. That is pretty strongly supported. But yeah, paleognathe phylogeny is still complicated. Do you have anything to add to this story?
Well, the only thing I'll say is that, I mean, hearing about the long branch attraction pulling the Moas and Tinamous further away, It does kind of make sense considering, that particular lineage. One branch leads to a moa and one branch leads to a tinamou.
Right.
Two birds that until recently we didn't even think had anything to do with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it totally makes sense.
Yeah, indeed. All right, so let's head onward. And so we're going to leave the paleognaths behind for now and go on to into the neonates, which are the subject of the entire rest of the series, and also incorporate like nearly all living birds. So, of course, when we met the neonates, this was the episode where we also talked about the group galloanserans, the group uniting the chickens and ducks, which are the sister group to all the rest of the neonates. But first, before we kind of went into that, we kind of introduced the neonates as a group. And one of the main features that gives neonates their name is that they have a very flexible palate, as you might recall. And this is what gives them their name, neonate, the new jaws, because it was long assumed that this really flexible palate was an innovation. It was a new trait that the neonates evolved, whereas the so-called paleognate birds were called that because it was assumed that they had a palate more similar to the ancestral state for crowned birds. Now, if you remember the previous update special from last year, we mentioned that this has been called into question recently because last year a paper came out looking at the skull of a close relative to modern birds called Ichthyornis from the Cretaceous. It was not a crowned bird, but a very close relative. It was very similar to crowned birds across most of its anatomy, except that it had teeth. And it turned out that there was evidence that previous paper presented that Ichthyornis actually had a palate more similar to neonates, so it had a joint in the middle of its palate, and not so much a paleognate-like palate. And so if this is the case, then that raises the possibility that the neonate palate was actually the one that evolved earlier in the origin of modern birds, and that paleognates kind of reverted back to a sort of less mobile palate. Really intriguing. Well, a new paper just came out, in fact, just a few weeks ago, kind of supporting this. And this is, for me, a pretty special paper because it was written primarily by one of my lab mates, Juan Benito. In fact, it is one of the chapters from his PhD. And several of my other lab mates also worked on this. Clara, who I mentioned earlier, who works on paleognates, also contributed to this paper. And another one of my lab mates, Pei Chen, also worked on this paper as well. And of course, our supervisor, Daniel Field, was one of the co-authors of this paper. So it was really great to see this project finally come together because I know they had all been working very hard on it for a long time. And so the main focus of this paper was actually to describe another close relative of crowned birds. This is a new species, so they named it in this paper, called Janavis phenalidens. And it was very similar to Ichthyornis in most respects, except it was quite a bit bigger. It was about the size of the largest gulls that we have today. And like Ichthyornis, it was probably pretty similar to crowned birds across most of its skeleton, except for having teeth. And also of note is that it was found at the same locality, basically, as one of the oldest known modern type birds, Asteriornis, the wonder chicken, which our lab also described, including myself. So that's a pretty interesting locality in that it shows that early members of the modern bird group were kind of living alongside their close relatives for some time in the same area at the same time. But anyways, Janavis is quite interesting. The specimen itself had actually been described before, but it had not been named. And at the time, they hadn't been able to kind of scan the specimen in a CT scanner, which is what our my lab mates did. And so in doing so, they were able to kind of look at the bones in a lot more detail. And it turned out that a lot of the bones in Janavis had previously been kind of misinterpreted or misidentified or simply not observed at all. And so they were able to provide a kind of up-to-date description of all these different bones. And so what kind of was a real selling point of the paper was that it turns out Janavis actually preserves one of the bones in the palate that had not been recognized before. So the Ichthyornis paper that came out last year found one of the bones in the palate called the palatine. It is one of the bones that forms this joint in the upper jaw of neoavian birds. But it didn't have the other bone that it connected to, the pterygoid. So they could tell from the palatine that, yeah, it seems like there would have been a joint there because they could see where it connects to the pterygoid, but it didn't have the pterygoid to go with it, right? Now, Janavis does not preserve the palatine, but it preserves the pterygoid. So we kind of have the other half of this now, and Janavis is, other than being bigger, it's almost identical to Ichthyornis in most other respects of the skeleton. There are some other differences too, but for all intents and purposes, it's essentially identical to Ichthyornis. And it turns out that it has a pterygoid, and it goes very well with that Ichthyornis palatine, despite being bigger. And it confirms that yes, these close relatives to modern birds had a joint in between the pterygoid and the palatine. And so they basically had a neonathous palate, even though they weren't members of the neonath clade. And in particular, my lab mates found that the pterygoid of Janavis particularly resembles, if you compare them across modern birds, the pterygoids of galloanserans, so the chicken and duck lineage. So this actually raises the possibility that the chicken and duck lineage actually have kind of the closest approximation to the ancestral palate of modern birds, and it is not the paleognaths that have this kind of close approximation as many people have once assumed. And so this paper was a pretty big deal in our field, and it got published in the journal Nature, one of the top tier scientific journals out there. So it was really fantastic to see this come out. Further evidence that the neonathous palate might have actually originated pretty early in bird evolution, quite contrary to what we have thought for well over a century. Do you have anything to add to this story?
Well, I'll just say I'm certainly glad to see papers like this, kind of further support for a sort of novel idea in evolution, in this case, the neonathous palate. It's exciting that we have two specimens now that add further support to this idea.
Alrighty then. So now let's get into some stories about the galloanserans proper. So on the next slide here, I have a very interesting story. And I don't remember if I actually talked about this controversy on the original episode that this story goes with. So to briefly describe, there are some large eggs, or these pieces of eggshells that came from some kind of large egg, bird egg that is, that are known from the Pleistocene of Australia. And traditionally, it has been thought that these eggs belonged to dromornithids. So these were, if you don't recall, the group nicknamed the Demon Ducks of Doom. These were these giant flightless birds. They were some of the largest birds of all time, but they were probably primarily herbivorous, and they had these gigantic beaks that were very intimidating looking. And so they were found in Australia. They pretty much spanned from the Paleogene to the Neogene, and they survived into the Pleistocene before dying out during the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. And these are big birds, so they find these big eggshells, or that these eggshells belong to big eggs, and it was assumed that these were dromornithid eggshells. But more recently, I think in the mid 2000s or so, it was proposed that maybe these were not dromornithid eggshells, but instead eggshells belonging to large megapodes, which we know also existed in the Pleistocene of Australia. So the megapodes are a group of galliforms, so members of the chicken-like bird lineage, and you might remember this from the episode. But megapodes are quite unusual among birds in that they do not incubate their eggs themselves. They instead bury their eggs either near geothermal sources, so near volcanoes, or they bury them under rotting vegetation and use the heat emitted from the decomposition of the vegetation to incubate their eggs. And the young are born very well developed. They can fly within hours of hatching in some cases. So quite an incredible group of birds. And in the Pleistocene, there were some large species of megapodes. Now, they weren't as big as the dromornithids, but because we don't have these complete eggs, it is possible that they also would have produced quite sizable eggs, and it has been proposed on various lines of evidence that actually these eggs belong to megapodes and not to dromornithids. Well, a new study decided to take a different approach to try and figure out this controversy, and they managed to extract some proteins from some of these eggshell samples, which is pretty interesting. And so, because of this, they were able to run these proteins through a phylogenetic analysis, and their conclusions were that it is more likely that these eggshells do actually belong to dromornithids because they included a megapode in their study, and so you might be able to see here it's a sort of the purpley gray branch Electra lithami. That is Australian brush turkey, which is a pretty common species of megapode. I saw them when I went to Brisbane for SVP in 2019. They are quite common there. You can find them just wandering like the cities and parks and such. But anyways, you'll see that the orange branch for the eggshell protein sequences do not clade with the megapode branch. So they argue that this is evidence that these eggshells actually do belong to dromornithids and not to giant megapodes. And this would be very interesting if true, because first of all, it also has implications about what dromornithids actually are, right? I mentioned in the episode that it is kind of unclear, actually, even though they're nicknamed the demon ducks of doom. We are actually not currently sure if they are dromornithids, that is, are closer to the chicken-like branch or the duck-like branch, or neither. And, if we can actually get proteins from these eggshells, and if these eggshells do belong to dromornithids, they could help us figure out that mystery. That being said, I have seen this study being viewed with some caution from researchers who study these birds. And part of the reason for this is, well, first of all, if you look carefully at the tree that they got here, there are some pretty clear errors in the reconstruction of this tree. Like some of the results majorly conflict with what we are pretty sure about the phylogeny of these birds. So, for example, if you see the branch below the eggshell protein sequences, that's Chana torquata, that belongs to a screamer. The screamers are a group of very unusual members of the kind of duck-like branch. But you'll notice that the screamer does not actually clade with the duck-like branch on here, right? It's kind of outside of both the chicken-like and the duck-like branches, and we know that's not correct. So it's like, if you have some of these errors in here, then how trustworthy are these results really? And you'll notice also that the megapode branch here is also in the quote-unquote wrong place. The megapodes should be kind of the lineage that is sister to all the other remaining galliforms, but here it's clading with Penelope pileata, which is a crassid. The crassids are a different group of galliform birds from the Americas. So there are definitely some errors in here, and that's not necessarily something unexpected or anything, because if the protein sequences are not particularly complete or what have you, then it is only natural that there would be some reconstruction errors in the phylogeny. But it does suggest that maybe we can't take the particular position that they found for the eggshell taxon as kind of gospel, so to speak. Something else is that they only included one species of megapode in this dataset, so one has to wonder, would that affect the results? It depends on maybe the quality of that particular sequence that they use. If they included more megapode species, I feel like the result would be more robust. That we can be more certain that this taxon really does not belong with the megapodes. So there's that. One more thing I've seen people raise is that this study does not really address the arguments of another recent study on this subject, and that was a study where they basically calculated the potential size of the eggs that these eggshells belong to, and they concluded that these eggs, even though they were pretty big, probably would not have been big enough to withstand the weight of a dromornithid sitting on them. And a dromornithid would have still had to incubate its own eggs, and so that's a pretty big problem if these eggs could not actually withstand their weight. And so that other study on the strength of the eggshell in these mystery eggs, they concluded that it was more likely that these eggs belonged to megapodes. So that's a study that was not really mentioned in this new protein study. So one has to wonder, how would you explain this if these are indeed dromornithid eggshells? That we'd have to find an explanation for that. So basically there is still some question about the identity of these eggs and the position of the dromornithids, but It is a really cool study. We haven't seen a lot of ancient protein studies being used on these Pleistocene bird taxa, so it is cool to see this study do so. Do you have anything to add to this before we move on?
Not particularly, but yeah, I'm definitely very curious uh, what further taxons would help kind of unravel this mystery here.
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty then. So let's go on, and we'll start with the anseriform lineage, the duck-like lineage. We found some particularly interesting fossil over the past year. At least one was described and named this past year. Um, so this particular fossil comes from the Miocene of Japan, um, and it's actually been known for a while. So it was actually first described in the early 2000s, and back then it wasn't named. However, it was basically just called the like I forget the exact wording used, but people would just say that, oh, there's this short-winged swan from Japan, and it was found in marine deposits, so like a short-winged marine swan, and it was described in the early 2000s. I think in the late 2000s, they also wrote another paper kind of describing it in more detail. But even then, they still didn't name it. But finally, this year, I think they were finally the authors were finally ready to kind of give it a name because they had kind of finished their study of all the bones in detail. And so they finally gave it a name, Anakacygna, I believe named after the place where it was found. And it is an incredibly strange bird. It is one of the most remarkable, not just birds, but I would say one of the most remarkable dinosaurs to have been named this year. So it certainly appears to be a swan overall, based on its anatomy, but it's got some very strange features for a swan. First of all, the head is very large relative to its body, by swan standards. And based on the kind of the surfaces for muscle attachment along the back of its head and along its lower jaw, the authors propose that this this swan would have been very good at kind of repeatedly opening and closing its mouth, like very very fast. And so it's like, what do you use this kind of motion for? This is very different from how modern swans feed, because modern swans mostly kind of dip their head underwater and they use a very long neck to reach the bottoms of lakes and ponds, and then they pull up water grass, mostly water plants and algae. But that's not the kind of motion that you would associate with kind of this repeated kind of opening and closing of the jaw. Instead, we look at other kinds of duck-like birds today that feed in this way. This is kind of a feature of specialized filter feeders. So a lot of the dabbling ducks and such, they will kind of put their beak close to the surface of water and kind of open and shut it really fast. So they kind of filter out a lot of little food particles that are in the water in this way. And so that's what the author suggests that Anakacygna was doing. So it was a filter feeding swan that lived out in the ocean. But not only that, the wings of Anakacygna were pretty short compared to its body size, and you can see that in the skeleton here. The bones that are shaded in, by the way, are the bones that are preserved in the specimen, if that weren't clear. And you might have noticed earlier I said that this was nicknamed kind of the Japanese short-winged swan. And so this is the reason for that. It's got rather short wings for its body size, and so it was almost certainly flightless. But also, the wings are also, not that reduced compared to some flightless birds out there, right? It's still pretty sizable. In fact, the authors point out that it actually has some muscle attachments that are still pretty well developed. And specifically, it has muscle attachments, or rather, it has attachments for muscles that kind of pull the wings above its back that are particularly well developed. So what could I use this for? Well, if we observe the behavior of modern swans, we can get a clue. Modern swans, when they do like displays, like threat displays, for example, some of the species, they will kind of spread their wings out to the sides and raise them above their back to make themselves look more intimidating. So definitely display is a possible function of these wings. But there's another function that swans use their wings for besides flying today, and that is in some species of modern swans, they'll actually raise the wings above their back to act as a bit of a cradle for their babies, and so their babies will actually climb on their back and sit on their parents' backs, and ride around on like a literal swan boat, basically. And the author suggests that this was what Anacosygna was specialized to do. It was, living out in the ocean. It was probably, pretty stormy waters sometimes. So probably having a safe shelter for its young would have been pretty important. And so it could use these specialized wings to act as a cradle for the young sitting on its back. And furthermore, we only have a little bit of its tail, but its tail also seems to have very big muscles for raising kind of it above the back as well. And so perhaps the tail was specialized for being to be lifted in this way and kind of forms the back end of that cradle. And you can kind of see that in the reconstructed kind of life restoration on the right here. So it's got its wings and its tail kind of flicked upward, and together they kind of perhaps would have formed a nice place for its young to sit. So really intriguing animal for sure, very unusual bird. There were, in fact, two species of Anacosygna that were named in this paper. So Anacosygna hajime is the more completely known one. The other one is actually only known from a bit of the leg, basically, but it's similar enough to the other species that the authors suggest that it's a member of the same genus. But yeah, something kind of really funny about this paper is that Anacosygna has so many bizarre features that the authors, like in their actual, like very technical scientific paper, they said that because of this bizarre combination of features, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not like actually reading from it right now, but they consider Anacosygna to be the ultimate bird of all time. Like they wrote this in a scientific paper. It was incredible. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. I don't know if I would consider it the ultimate bird of all time, but it's definitely a very spectacular and interesting and bizarre bird, that's for sure. So yeah, this is definitely one of the highlights in bird paleontology of this year, and is also a reason I used Anacosygna as the title slide for this episode. Do you have anything to add about this very strange bird?
Yeah, it seems like a swan trying to be both a dabbling duck and a plesiosaur.
Yeah, right.
Is the because like that neck,
Yeah.
is that neck significantly longer than like other swans, or is that like kind of normal for an animal with those proportions?
I would say they probably, because as you can see, the complete neck is not known. So I think they base the length of the neck on living swans. And yeah, swans have long necks, as I'm sure you're aware. In fact, in terms of vertebral count, I think they have some of the most neck vertebrae of any modern animal. So yeah, I think the long neck there is partly based on modern swans.
Got it. Yeah, and I guess it can depend because I mean like reptiles as a whole, when it comes to neck vertebrae, like over time they can just add more.
Right.
It's not like mammals where they have to stretch it to the limit.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I guess it is kind of like it certainly would be an open question about like kind of what this neck was doing, but I think it's kind of cool. Like I have seen swans and like of course and other birds like loons like hold their babies on
Yeah.
their backs. So like kind of the idea that this bird was like more adapted to that
Right.
by not like having both the wings and the tail kind of make a little cradle. Like that's cute. I
Yeah.
like that. And I like that that's pretty much illustrated here, isn't it?
Right.
Those
Yeah.
little fuzzy things there. I
I
was
think
kind of
so.
wondering like what is that?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
those are babies. That's awesome. Yeah, certainly a spectacular bird. Ultimate though, yeah, that's definitely like that would certainly be a fantasy football kind of thing to do. Have people vote what the ultimate bird is, but
Right. Yeah.
I mean that's a spectacular fossil, like, even for the incompleteness
Right.
that we have so much of it. That's fantastic.
Definitely a spectacular find. Not to be outdone, the galliforms also gave us a pretty cool fossil earlier this year. We'll see on the next slide. This is Centauri avis from the Miocene of the United States, I think specifically Nebraska. And you can see how beautiful this fossil is. Like, you do not get bird fossils this well preserved every day, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Now, Centauri avis is not as weird as an Acosigna. In many ways, it's a fairly typical galliform. If specifically, it's a member of the phasianid group, so that's a group that includes things like pheasants and chickens and turkeys. What's quite interesting is that it seems to be a member of the lineage that leads up to the turkeys and grouse, which is pretty cool. So turkeys and grouse have not always traditionally been considered close relatives, but that is what the genetics kind of have indicated. And this member, or this species seems to be an early member of that lineage. So a kind of a prototype turkey grouse, which is pretty cool. It also seems to support the idea that that particular clade of galliforms originated in North America, because after all, this early member of that lineage was found in North America. And I would say that the skull here is so well preserved, like it's like basically in 3 dimensions, that the authors of this paper were able to reconstruct what the brain of the of Centauri avis was shaped like, and so that was pretty cool. How the details of the anatomy there are pretty technical. In many ways, it's kind of a pretty typical galliform brain, although it does have a few odd features. But it's pretty amazing that we were able to reconstruct the brain of such an ancient bird in such high fidelity. So yeah, Centauri avis, that's another great find. And the name Centauri avis, it basically means 100 bird, think century, and that's a deliberate reference because apparently this particular specimen, had been sitting in the museum for like almost a century before people actually described it. And so that's kind of remarkable for such an amazing specimen. That, people didn't want to describe this right away. But yeah, so I'm glad it's finally seen the light of day. And this is another really cool fossil. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean it's beautiful. It's very beautiful. I love the photo here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean certainly not to toot my horn because I know we've talked about this before, but I'm telling you, those museum collections, the stuff that's just sitting there. I mean, there's gold mine in those hills, so to speak. I can't wait to see more stuff like that in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely. New finds are being made in museum collections all the time. They're incredibly important for our science. Alrighty then, so we're done with the galloanserans stories now. The next story, we are going to move on to neoavians, which are all the remaining birds that aren't paleognaths or galloanserans. And one of the big kind of takeaway points when we introduce neoavians is that their phylogeny is an absolute mess, and we can't agree on any portion of it. I mean, that's a bit of hyperbole, but we basically can't agree on how all the major neoavian groups are related, and almost no 2 studies have found the same result. So a few more studies on the subject have come out in the last year or so, and yeah, they basically confirm that we still can't agree on neoavian phylogeny. But the approaches that they used are pretty interesting. So here's one study on this subject, where what they basically did, and I'm like kind of simplifying a lot here, partly because molecular phylogenetics is not my main field of expertise, and partly because the details are pretty darn technical and would probably be pretty boring for me to try and explain. But what they did was they tried to investigate several particularly controversial parts of neoavian phylogeny, and they wanted to find out if particular genes, like individual genes, supported particular hypotheses over others, or whether there were like a particular proportion of these genes supporting some of these hypotheses over another. And so they investigated 3 main questions in neoavian phylogeny. One is like, which group of neoavians is a sister group to everybody else? Huge controversy there, with basically no agreement. One is the position of the Hoatzin. Again, another huge controversy there, with basically no agreement. And we talked about this particular controversy in episode 6, I believe, of Dinosaurs, the second chapter of the original series. But they covered it here, so we'll mention it here. And they also wanted to look at the position of owls, which I think we also mentioned. So that particular question is arguably not as controversial as the other 2, but still pretty controversial. Basically, we're not sure if owls are closer to the hawks and eagles, or to the woodpecker and kingfisher group, or what. So what they did was they kind of used multiple different data sets and kind of evaluated what proportion of genes supported which hypotheses. So kind of a brief overview is that when it comes to which neoavian group is a sister to the rest, all the genes are pretty evenly spread. Like there's no obvious like standout hypothesis here. Yeah, so basically the genes can't agree. Yeah, so that well kind of confirms what we were thinking before, that we it's very difficult to figure out this particular phylogenetic question. So it remains kind of unresolved. The Hoatzin, it turns out, the Hoatzin problem, according to their results, had a very interesting kind of quote unquote solution, quote unquote, because I'm sure this is not the last word by any means, but they found that the majority of the genes that they examined supported the Hoatzin being the sister group of the shorebirds, which is interesting because this was not a result that any of the previous kind of big, large scale molecular phylogenies of birds had actually found. There was one that found Hoatzin being the sister group of shorebirds plus gruiforms, the crane and rail group, but not like to the shorebirds specifically. But in their results, they found that quite a large proportion of genes actually support Hoatzin and shorebird together, or shorebirds together. So that's pretty unusual. That being said, they also found that there's basically what they call a complex data type effect going on here. Basically, the type of data that you use also influences like exactly how much support that this hypothesis has. And they found that even though consistently, all their analyses found that being sister to the shorebirds was their best supported result, or at least supported by the greatest number of genes. The type of data that they analyzed did influence like the amount of support that it got. So there is potentially still some kind of artifact going on here, and so I'm sure that there will be many more studies to come that will give us like different answers to where the Hoatzin actually belongs. So it still refuses to really be solved. And when it comes to the owls, they found that the majority of their genes supported the owls being sister to the mouse birds, an unusual group of tree-dwelling birds, which is quite interesting. This is also not a result that has been recovered by most of the kind of very big-scale analyses. But they also noticed that a lot of the support for putting owls' sister group to the hawk and eagle group are probably driven by these kind of similar data type effects that they mentioned earlier. That being said, strictly speaking, what they found was that it's kind of the interaction between data type effect and the type of gene that they analyze that seems to be driving kind of the owl and hawk group. So they suggest that particular result that has been found in some analyses is at least likely to be an artifact. But whether owls actually are the sister group to mouse birds, I think is still remains to be seen. But I think they took a pretty interesting approach to kind of studying these questions in neoavian phylogeny. On the next slide, I have a different study that also looked at neoavian phylogeny, and they did this in a different way. So they particularly focused on a type of genetic element called retroelement. And so these are parts of the genome that get transcribed into RNA. In the cell, parts of the genome can get transcribed into RNA. For example, if the body needs to use these instructions, that's what genetic data is after all, for making particular proteins or things like that and to build the body. And so to do this, they transcribe the genetic data into RNA first. So originally it's DNA when it's kind of just being stored there. So what happens with retroelements is that they get transcribed into RNA, back into DNA, and then they get inserted into some place in the genome, which is kind of a very unusual way of doing things. But there's something that happens, and especially it often originates due to virus infections, because this is basically how viruses, or at least some kinds of viruses, replicate themselves, is that they basically give the body instructions, the host body instructions on how to make more of these viruses, and in doing so they kind of insert their own genetic sequences into part of the host's genetic sequences. So yeah, lots of interesting evolutionary stories going on there. But the key thing to know about using retroelements for phylogenetic reconstruction is that it's gonna be very rare for like these retroelements to be reinserted into the same parts of the genome kind of independently in different lineages, right? Like a genetic sequence is so long that if you're gonna like insert the same retroelement into the same position, that's gonna take a lot of luck. And so a lot of people have pointed out that this makes retroelements very useful for phylogenetic reconstruction because closely related groups are likely to have retroelements in the same positions in their genome. And so that's kind of what this study investigated with regards to birds. And you might say, that sounds great. That means we can solve neoavian phylogeny, right? Well, no. Well, because when we're dealing with the problem of neoavian phylogeny, the problem is that probably these groups all diversified from each other in a very, very short period of time. And so there's probably a period of time during like this really rapid diversification that all these lineages that were barely diverged from each other were all probably interbreeding and stuff. So there was a lot of gene flow kind of going in between them. And that means they would have exchanged a lot of these genes, including like the positions of the retroelements. So it is not so straightforward as just looking at the retroelement and saying, hey, here's the correct tree. That being said, the retroelements can help. So what they did was they analyzed retroelements together with like typical genetic sequences. And what they found was that analyzing the retroelements alone kind of gives us a tree where there's actually quite a bit of conflict with the tree you get when you analyze the remaining genetic sequences. But if you analyze them together, it turns out that there's actually a fair bit of support in the retroelements for certain clades that the retroelements by themselves may not have resolved before. So in a way, this is kind of similar to some of the controversies between like molecular and morphological phylogenies, where like originally we thought one thing based on morphology, but then when you combine it with the genetic data, you find, oh, actually, we have morphological data that supports these seemingly novel relationships. And so that's kind of what they found with the retroelements here, is that the gray circles on these different nodes are like clades where they found like increased retroelement support when you analyze it alongside the other genetic sequences. And they also found something really interesting in regards to the group Teleravies when they looked at these retroelements, but I'm going to save that for when we get into the Teleravian episodes. But yeah, this is still an interesting study in terms of what it tells us about neoavian phylogeny. Do they resolve neoavian phylogeny? Well, obviously the answer is not exactly, but they do give us like further support for some of these controversial nodes in the tree. Do you have anything to add before we move on?
Not particularly, but it's incredibly fascinating to see all of this.
Yeah, so neoavian phylogeny is still a mess, and I'm sure there will be many more fruitful research projects on this topic to come. But let's continue. So we're coming back to that study by George Sangster and colleagues now, where they named a bunch of new they gave a bunch of new names to bird clades. And so this is just a kind of bookkeeping note, is that we now have a name for the group containing the sandgrouse and mesites. You might recall mesites are a group of very unusual ground-dwelling birds from Madagascar. Sandgrouse are a group of mostly kind of arid area dwelling birds. They're very similar to pigeons in their overall appearance and are pretty closely related to pigeons too, as you can see here, where they have the very unusual habit of like soaking their feathers in water to bring water back for their young. But despite looking a lot like pigeons, it turns out that sandgrouse are even more closely related to the mesites. And so the authors of this study gave this clade a name. It's called Pterocles mesites. And this is yet another one of those names where they basically combined the names of two members of this group together. So the sandgrouse group is Pterocliformes, and one of the genera of sandgrouse is Pterocles. And of course, mesites refers to the mesites, so Pterocles mesites. So that's the name of this clade now. But we can move on from there. Now let's jump ahead, several episodes really, to episode 7. That was the episode on shorebirds. You might recall shorebirds are an incredibly diverse group. They include things like the plovers and the sandpipers, many of which do indeed feed on the shore, but there are many members of the group that are adapted to other types of habitats as well, and they don't include just these kind of shoreline dwelling birds that probe the mud for food, but also things like auks, which spend a lot of time out at sea, like diving underwater. They include things like the gulls and the terns that kind of fly over the water to find their food. And so, in that episode, I mentioned that we have a couple of fossils of Eocene birds that have been suggested to be stem shorebirds. So they're not members of the modern shorebird group, but they're more closely related shorebirds than anything else. And so they might give us an idea of what the ancestral shorebird was like. And one of these taxa that I mentioned that might be a stem shorebird was Scandiavis, which is from the early Eocene of Denmark. So a news story that came out late last year, found a second specimen of Scandiavis. And it was really cool in that they were able to kind of CT scan it and get a kind of good look at its skull. And it turns out that its skull is very wonderfully preserved. You can see it pictured here as a CT scan, and it's basically preserved in 3 dimensions. And similar to Centuriavis, who we saw before, they were able to reconstruct the brain anatomy of Scandiavis here. And it turns out that with the new information that they got from this second specimen, they found additional support that Scandiavis may indeed be a stem shorebird. So that's pretty cool to have. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so on the next slide, I have another shorebird story. So this is a new phylogenetic study on shorebirds. This one is a phylogenetic analysis of modern shorebirds, so the living species, and it is by far the biggest phylogenetic analysis of shorebirds that has pretty much ever been done. And so here's the kind of basic results of the study. It's of course a massive study, so there are a lot of details in here that are not being shown in this figure, otherwise it would be too hard to read. In terms of the phylogenetic relationships that are shown on here, there weren't any major surprises, at least not in terms of like the major groups of these shorebirds, of the interrelationships between them. So pretty much the tree that I presented back when I did the shorebird episode still holds up based on this study. That being said, arguably more interesting is that they also use this opportunity to do a time-scaled phylogenetic tree. And so basically they tried to estimate when these divergences between these different groups happen. And they use like all the most up-to-date information on the fossil record of shorebirds. And their results, I think, are pretty noteworthy because I mentioned during the episode that there's been this sort of kind of long-standing hypothesis that perhaps shorebirds had already originated back in the Cretaceous, right? But I also mentioned in the episode that there are a lot of reasons to be suspicious of this conclusion, and it is quite likely, in fact, many of the studies then, when I did the episode, were already suggesting that no, actually, probably modern shorebirds only originated after the Cretaceous, and a lot of the supposed Cretaceous shorebirds are just, fossils that happen to resemble modern shorebirds but are not necessarily members of that group. And this is actually supported by the study here. So when they went into this study, the authors did not assume that shorebirds originated after the Cretaceous, but when they ran their analysis with all the most up-to-date information from the fossil record, their results concluded that modern shorebirds originated in the Paleocene and not in the Cretaceous, and in fact they found pretty good support for this result. This is a really impressive study, definitely by far the largest phylogenetic tree, and certainly the largest time-scaled phylogenetic tree for shorebirds that has been done. So I was really glad to see this paper come out. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm impressed to see it too. I do love that they have to put the little falling foli just to let you know, by the way, that's the extinction line.
That's right. Yeah, that's a nice touch.
Yeah. Were there any like new phylogenetic results that came out of this, or has it kind of gotten sort of the same sort of topology that we had discussed prior?
So there are some, but a lot of that is within kind of the individual species of shorebirds. So they did kind of shake up some of the relationships within some of these groups. But yeah, because that's not a detail that we went into during our series. I decided not to really discuss that in extensively. But in terms of like the major groups that are pictured here, these relationships are pretty much consistent with what we talked about previously.
Okay, fantastic. But hey, like the interspecies relationship, that's always fun because that could
Absolutely.
mean maybe new genera or something like
Yeah.
that.
Alrighty then. So let's continue onward. The first of two episodes on the waterbird clade. And well, it turns out that in future episodes I would no longer have to keep using the term the waterbird clade for this group because people have finally given it a name. And again, this was the paper by George Sangster and colleagues that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, I talked about this in the episode, but basically the clade that contains the phaethontomorphs, which include the tropic birds, kagu, and sunbittern, which are not birds that most people are familiar with, but if you're not familiar with them, you can go back to the episode and hear me talk about them. And acornithes, which is a group that includes kind of the rest of the major waterbird clades, like loons, penguins, petrels, pelicans, herons, and so on. The group containing phaethontomorphs and acornithians had not really had a name, even though it had been recovered by several recent molecular phylogenetic studies. And I mentioned in the episode that people have kind of decided to like informally kind of recruit some old names for this group potentially. So I know like John Boyd, who runs the website Taxonomy in Flux, which is a very cool and useful website on bird phylogeny. He used the name RDA for this group, which is a really old name that used to contain like basically herons and heron-like birds, not all of which we think are closely related today. And he decided to use that name for this new kind of newly recognized waterbird clade. And I've suggested like the name Natatores, which was an old name for like containing a bunch of waterbirds, could also be used for this clade as well. But the authors of this paper took a different approach and decided to give it an entirely new name called Phaethocornithes. And again, they took the names of the two major lineages and put them together. So Phaetho, of course, comes from Phaethontomorphs, which in terms comes from the genus Phaethon for the tropic birds. And Cornithes, of course, comes from Acornithes, which is the remaining waterbird group. So yeah, now we can call it Phaethocornithes, and I don't have to keep saying this is the waterbird clade, which we might call RDA or Natatores or something else. So we can call it Phaethocornithes now. So that's a relief. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally fine with that. I mean, at the end of the day, like these things become official, and for the most part, we kind of just have to go with them. Although I am curious, though, like you said that they already had an appropriate name, in a sense, for this group, Natatores. I think I've heard of that too. And I think we talked about it a little bit. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, we already have these names; they're in the literature in a sense, even if they're not maybe necessarily common names in the literature, but to just kind of give more new names to things that we could already like kind of resurrect. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I will say if I had written this paper, I probably would have suggested the name Natatores or for this clade, but I know, or at least I can guess the reason why the authors did things the way they did, because traditionally Natatores has kind of been used as a sort of umbrella term to cover like all kinds of water birds, and not just members that we now recognize as like members of this group. So like it used to include things like the ducks and geese, for example, which are definitely not closely related to these particular birds. And so I suspect the authors, their thinking was that, well, traditionally the name Natatores has included like so many different members of this group that aren't like that don't actually correspond to this clade, that we might as well just give it a new name. But kind of my thinking on this would be that the spirit of the name is still similar. Like Natatores was a group that was meant to include like this big group of water dwelling birds or like water associated birds. So now that we know that there is a clade of like this big diverse clade of water associated birds, we could just apply that name to this, like even if it doesn't include strictly all the same content of the group. So yeah, and in fact, quite recently, in 2007 in a big paper by Livesey and Zusi. They proposed a classification based on a morphological analysis where they actually did use the name Natatores for kind of a group that they found, which very closely approximates this group that we now recognize today. And so based on that, I would have said, yeah, there is precedent for using Natatores for like approximately this group of birds, so we might as well use it. However, I can understand the author's approach as well. So this really comes down to like different philosophies of how we name things and how we pick names for things. And so in the end, I'm fine with calling it Phaeocornithes. But yeah, if I had been the one writing the paper, I would have done things differently.
Sure, I totally hear that. I mean, honestly, it reminds me of a situation in like mammal phylogeny.
Oh yeah,
where like there's a group Eulipotyphla
right.
that we recognize nowadays that includes the moles, hedgehogs, shrews, and the weird selenodons of the Caribbean. But the reason it's called Eulipotyphla is because there's an older group, Lipotyphla, that not only included those, but like some of the Afrotheres that we've mentioned here and there on the show, mammals that aren't related to the shrews and moles in their kind. And so I guess as a way to like make it more specific, they made it Eulipotyphla.
Right.
But I've heard people argue back and forth that like either name is fine.
Yeah.
So I hear what you're saying totally.
Yeah. So let's continue onward. And yeah, here we go. So this is the first of several fossils we're going to meet in this episode that come from the Lendon Clay Formation from the early Eocene of the United Kingdom. And so this is one of those fossils I mentioned that Gerald Mayr figures in his new edition of Paleogene Fossil Birds. So it turns out that there used to be a fossil collector named Michael Daniels who passed away within recent years, and he had amassed a massive collection of bird fossils from the Lendon Clay Formation. And finally, I think that just before his death, he finally agreed to donate his collection of bird fossils to the National Museum of Scotland, and so that's where they're housed now. And so finally, these specimens can be described by researchers. And so I know Gerald Mayr and Andrew Kitchener, who's I believe one of the curators at the museum, have been working really hard on describing many of these bird fossils. And so just this past year, like a ton of these Lendon clay fossils have been described by them. And a lot of these fossils were figured before they were actually described in the second edition of Paleogene Fossil Birds. And so I believe this is one of them. So this is a really cool find. It seems to be an early member of the loon lineage, so it's a stem loon. They named it Nasideites. And it's quite interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it appears to have been, if you look at its kind of hind limb bones, for example, it's a pretty complete fossil. It's not essentially complete, but there's quite a bit of it preserved. Like you have bones from both the forelimbs and the hind limbs. There's a bit of the skull too. And if you look at the hind limb bones, there seems to be a bird that was capable of swimming and diving, but definitely doesn't have all the specializations that a modern loon would have. And we mentioned in the episode corresponding to this that modern loons are incredibly specialized divers, some of the most specialized foot-propelled diving birds that we have nowadays. So this was sort of a prototype loon that was able to dive, but maybe not quite to the extent that modern ones can. And not only that, but if you look at the skull, in the lower left here, just above the big letter C, that's the skull. And look at the shape of the beak. The beak is quite a bit shorter and a little bit blunter than a modern loon would be. Like a modern loon has a very long kind of pointed bill. They're very, very good for kind of spearing fish and such. But Nasideites had a rather different, somewhat more delicate-looking bill, so probably it was feeding in a very different way. The author suggests that perhaps it was maybe feeding on like kind of, things that couldn't run away or swim away rather as much as fish. So probably like aquatic invertebrates, like say aquatic insects or small snails and things that could pick off the bottom of a pond. So that seems plausible. So yeah, this is gives us a good look at what early loons might have looked like. In fact, it is the oldest unambiguous fossil of a stem loon. I mentioned in the episode, I think, that there have been some fossils from like the late Cretaceous that people have claimed might be loons, but those are extremely controversial. Quite a few other people have looked at them and said no, these are probably not loons. They're just like other types of diving birds are superficially loon-like. But Nasodites does seem like pretty convincingly to be an early member of the loon lineage. So our earliest representative of a stem loon, at least unambiguously. So that's pretty cool. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do like loons.
Yeah.
So I have a history with that, and like it's cool that we actually have this fossil now. Like we can actually say, "Hey, this is an early loon,"
Yeah.
and we can even make some statements about its biology.
Absolutely.
Do we have any? Was there any like paleo art of this yet?
Ooh, not that I've seen actually. Yeah, I have not seen any, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I would love to see more paleo art of this bird.
Yeah, because like I'm very curious about like a stem loon, like a transitional species
Mhm.
of loon that like is like picking at little water invertebrates,
Yeah,
and like it's not the lineage hasn't yet spawned like the fast deep divers that we're all used to.
yeah.
It's kind of cool. It'd be cool to compare the two
Mhm.
because yeah, it looks like we got some pretty good bones that I think we would be able to make an appropriate reconstruction. I would think.
Yeah, I would think so. I would definitely consider this complete enough to do a decent restoration of. So yeah, that would be awesome. So if any paleo artists are out there listening to this, hint hint. Um, okay. So let's go on to the next slide. So we're in the second episode for the waterbird clade, or I should say Phaethocornithes now. So this was the episode where we looked at the group Pelecanimorphae, the group that includes storks, boobies, cormorants, frigate birds, pelicans, herons, and their kin. So rather diverse radiation of Phaethocornithians. And the story here is that some new specimens of Leptoptelos robustus have been described. And now, if you don't recall what Leptoptelos robustus was, this was the giant stork from Flores. You might recall that. So thought to be something kind of similar to our modern marabou stork, but bigger, something like 1.8 meters tall or something, I think is the estimate. And it lived in the Pleistocene of the island Flores in Indonesia, alongside the so-called hobbits, Homo floresiensis. So these would have been like these giant birds, much taller than these small hominins, that probably may have hung around in similar spaces, perhaps both feeding from the same carcasses even. And Leptoptelos robustus, is certainly a spectacular bird. And these new specimens certainly tell us quite a bit more about its biology. Most notably, I might have mentioned in the episode that it was thought at the time that Leptoptelos robustus could have potentially been flightless, or at least had reduced flight capabilities. And this was because in one of its hindlimb bones, it seemed like the bone walls were pretty thick, so that seemed like something that would weigh it down. And not only that, but at the time, they found one of its wing bones, and they said that, oh, this wing bone is actually pretty small compared to this hindlimb bone. And so maybe it had reduced wings, and so couldn't fly very well, if at all. But these new specimens kind of have changed the picture quite a bit. So it turns out that it actually had quite well-developed wing bones. And in fact, the new interpretation is that the original kind of wing bone and hindlimb bone that the previous study looked at, these probably came from different individuals of different ages, so that's why the proportions seem very off. But now that they have like more specimens of this animal, it turns out that it did not have reduced wings at all, and was probably still a perfectly good flyer. So maybe the hobbits could have ridden them to Flores after all. But but this also has some implications about kind of the evolutionary history of Leptoptelos robustus, because we actually do know in the Pleistocene of other members of the stork genus Leptoptelos that were also bigger than the modern marabou stork. So we have like this whole like series of giant stork species that were found not only on Flores but also on continental Asia and in Africa. And so it may be that Leptoptelos robustus was like a member of this like whole radiation of giant storks that happened to make it to Flores. and not like an example of island gigantism where like a previously small ancestor became big on an island. Instead, they might have been already been big, and then they just managed to get to that island. So pretty interesting. Um, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, it reminds me a lot about the Komodo dragons
Yes.
on Flores, because that species managed to reach there,
Hmm.
and as I understand it, like they're about the same size as Komodo dragons in other places.
That's right.
So that's really interesting to hear. Yeah, I mean, as far as Pleistocene megafauna goes, I mean, we talk about mammoths and sloths and bison, but giant storks, like a panoply of giant storks, is not something that you usually see in
Right.
tropical culture. So I'm glad we have more that we can add to our understanding, and
Hmm.
hopefully these birds get a little bit more press, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yeah, I guess for people who are unaware, Komodo dragons are only found on a few Indonesian islands today, including Flores. But we know from the fossil record that they used to be found in like Australia, for example. In fact, they might have originated there. So yeah, that's what it's meant when we say that the Komodo dragon is not an island giant either. Like it was already that big when it evolved in Australia, and it just happened to make it up into Indonesia, where it is still found today. Um, so yeah, let's move on to the next slide. And in another new name, this is a name for the group uniting the Suliforms. So this is the frigatebird booby and cormorant group, and the pelecaniforms, the ibis, heron, and pelican group. Previously, when we talked about this clade, they did not have a name, but the authors of the Sangster et al. Paper, once again, coined a new name for this group called pelecanes. So very, very straightforward name. It's basically named after the pelicans. And well, I mean, fair enough. It will make discussing this clade a little bit easier in the future if we don't want to talk about the storks. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. I imagine you probably don't have much to add to that.
No, not really.
All right.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay, so now we can move on to Teleraves. So this is a group, extremely diverse group of mostly tree-dwelling and some ground-dwelling birds, which includes things like songbirds, parrots, woodpeckers, kingfishers, and all the various bird of prey groups. And we talked about all of them back when we did our series. So we mentioned when we introduced Teleraves that there is some controversy still about the relationships within this group, particularly the position of the hawk and eagle group versus the owl group versus the mouse birds versus the woodpeckers and kingfishers, or at least the group containing those two. And so this figure comes from the paper on retroelements that I mentioned earlier. And they found something really interesting about the retroelement signal, phylogenetic signal in Teleraves, because they were also interested in, where do owls go within this group? And they found that there is basically very close to equal support from the retroelements of putting owls with the hawks and eagles versus putting them with cavitates, which is the group leading up to the woodpeckers and kingfishers. But they did not find much support for putting the hawk and eagle group with cavitates, so putting the other two groups together. So they interpret this as perhaps a signal of ancient hybridization events occurring within this group. So perhaps the owl lineage, when it diverged, no matter which group it is actually really closer to, it may be that there were genetic contributions from both the hawk and eagle group and the cavitavian lineage that gave rise to the owl group, which is a really intriguing possibility. And it is true that, owls do seem to share features from both of these lineages. So maybe this is the answer to where owls go. I don't know, but I think it's an intriguing idea. What about you?
I mean, I know I've joked about this before with the Watson, but like, if there's this like serious discussion that that's where the owl lineage may have originated, I was not expecting that.
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh, yeah. I'm honestly kind of speechless right now. I think it'd be, I mean, certainly would be a fascinating result if it's further confirmed. I guess kind of goes to show that evolution is no stranger to great surprises.
Indeed, indeed. I'm definitely also interested uh, to hear more about the subject, and yeah, totally. Alrighty, so let's move on. So in the original episode, episode 10, where we introduced Teleraves, we mostly focused on two different groups. So one was the owls, but also the accipitrimorphs. So these would be the vultures, hawks, and eagles, and including both the American vultures and the Afro-Eurasian vultures, which evolved the vulture lifestyle independently. And in fact, within the Afro-Eurasian vultures, if you recall, that lifestyle evolved independently in two different lineages too. So yeah, the vulture lifestyle has happened quite a bit. But anyways, this is a really cool new find, and this is a new species of, rather, a new genus of Pleistocene vulture. Now, the species had already been named before, but it was classified under a different genus. In fact, it is a genus that we don't recognize anymore. It's called Taphatus. But the, okay, bit of taxonomy kind of trivia or kind of minutiae here, but the type species of Taphatus is now considered to be kind of the same species as the modern wedge-tailed eagle, which is in the genus Aquila. Which means that this other species of Taphatus, Taphatus lacertosus, cannot be considered the same genus as that. In fact, that may not even be the whole story. I think these two species were actually named Taphatus like independently, except like the eagle already had that name, so this one would have had to be renamed anyway. Anyways, it's complicated, but but basically, some researchers from Australia actually decided to restudy the specimens of Taphatus lacertosus, and what they found was that they not only restudied the original specimen, but they actually described some new specimens that belong to the same species as this. And what they found was that this certainly was not an eagle. In fact, they suggest, based on their analyses, that this was actually a vulture, and is specifically a member of the one of the Afro-Eurasian vulture lineages. And that is extremely, extremely interesting because in the modern day, there are no vultures in Australia. And in fact, there are no real like scavenging specialist birds in Australia today. But knowing that there actually was one now, and so they gave it a new genus, Cryptogyps, the hidden vulture, for perhaps obvious reasons relating to the history of its discovery. Now that we know that there was this vulture as recently as the Pleistocene in Australia, it turns out that we actually did have like a scavenging kind of avian guild previously present in Australia. So why aren't they there now? Well, the author suggests that this probably had to do with the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, and we kind of see this mirrored in the Americas, as you might recall. And both the Americas and Australia suffered tremendously from the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. A ton of Pleistocene megafauna died out during that time. And these scavenging birds probably relied a lot on the carcasses of large animals. So when all these large animals died out, they were left with probably not a lot of food to eat. And so that might have led to the demise, which we've known for a while about the scavenging birds in the Americas. Many of them died out from a formerly very diverse guild. But also, this seems to have happened in Australia as well, with this Pleistocene vulture, Cryptogyps, that may have suffered a similar fate when the Pleistocene megafauna of Australia died out. So, very cool find. Most of the fossils are not that complete. For example, these are like the tips of the upper arm bone, the humerus, but there are quite a lot of interesting details, as you can see from the labels on here, at the tips of these limb bones. So they were able to do quite a lot of comparisons with modern birds of prey to try and figure out what kind of bird this was. So good find, I'd say. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think the name is perfect.
Yes.
We're all kind of scratching our heads. Where's our Australian scavenger bird?
Yeah.
And then here we go.
Exactly. So going on to the next slide, this is a study on the behavior of Haast's eagle. Now, studies on the behavior of extinct animals are always fun. This is a study that decided to look at, as you might recall from the episode, the largest eagle to have ever existed, the Haast eagle of New Zealand. We know from fossil evidence that it preyed on moa, some of the largest birds ever to have existed, which must have been a spectacular sight to see. And so what they were looking at was like, how did Haast's eagle, this really big eagle that does things that no modern eagle really does, how did it use its beak and its talons? And so what they did was they applied what they call finite element analysis to the skull and the claws of Haast's eagle. And I talked about finite element analysis, I believe, back on the show, I think in our terror bird episode. But this is basically an approach that uses the material properties of something, in this case bone, and then you model the shape of of the thing you're looking at, and then based on the material properties, based on what it's made of, you can run the model through simulations applying different forces, and you can simulate like different scenarios. Like, for example, what happens if this animal uses its skull for biting, or like if it uses its skull for tearing things. You can model these different movements under finite element analysis and see how it behaves, and you can see how well suited like these structures are for doing the particular behavior that you have modeled. And so this is what they did with Haast's eagle, and they compared it to a range of modern raptors, including both primarily scavenging and primarily predatory forms. And so the trees that you see on these figures here, these are not depicting phylogenetic relationships. And I know this is really confusing because throughout this entire series, I've been showing you phylogenetic trees showing phylogenetic relationships. But for this particular slide, you have to get rid of that idea. These trees are not showing phylogenetic relationships. They're not showing like the common ancestry of these different species pictured on the slide. They are showing the similarity of like the results of the phylogenetic analysis for these different skulls, basically. So the skulls or claws that behave similarly under different scenarios are going to cluster closer together compared to those that are more distinct from each other. That's what it's showing here. So with the skull, they modeled several different scenarios for these raptor skulls. I think the top left, letter A, is modeling just simple biting, just up and down closure of the jaws. The one in letter B, I think, is a kind of up and down tearing. So if it's grabbing hold of something and then kind of moving its head vertically to pull it off. And then the letter C, I think, is modeling side-to-side shaking of the head if it's got something in its jaws. And letter D, I think, is kind of pulling backwards. So it's grabbed onto something and it moves its head backwards to tear it off. And so what they found was that it seems that in some ways the skull of Haast's eagle behaves pretty similarly to modern eagles. So if you're not familiar with the scientific names, Hieratus moori, and they use abbreviations here, so you'll see like HEI moori, that's Haast's eagle. Aquila audax is a modern wedge-tailed eagle. And there are two other accipitrids, predatory accipitrids on here. So Hieratus morphnoides is another eagle, and in fact is the same genus as the Haast's eagle, but still alive today. And Hal sphenurus is a kite. Vulture gryphus is a condor, an American vulture, and Aegypius monachus is an Afro-Eurasian vulture. So in terms of like biting, for example, Haast's eagle skull behaves pretty similarly to other types of eagles. However, something interesting is that when it comes to like backwards tearing, Haast's eagle actually plots closer to the scavenging vultures in the lower right on the left hand figure. You can see that it's plotting close to Vulture gryphus and Aegypius monachus. So this is pretty curious, but it actually makes some sense, right? Haas eagle was like killing like these gigantic prey items that it were way too big for it to actually fly off with. So probably a lot of its feeding behavior would have been like opening these big carcasses of like much bigger animals, which is kind of similar to what vultures are doing, except vultures didn't kill it themselves. So in some ways, Haas eagle might have fed quite similarly to a vulture. However, when it comes to how the talons behave, it turns out that Haas eagle's talons also plot very closely to like actual eagles. So unlike vultures, it was definitely using its talons to kind of kill things, and probably quite large things too. So this is a pretty cool kind of modeling approach to understanding the ecology of this magnificent bird. Do you have anything to add to this?
Not particularly, but I think it's kind of good to see that we can get some more understanding of its feeding behavior by plotting it like this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm always a big fan of these sorts of studies.
Definitely. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. And so it turns out the owls also had quite a few notable fossil finds this past year as well. Um, so, first of all, is this stem owl, and this is another fossil from the Lendon Clay Formation, part of that same collection I talked about earlier. And this is a stem owl that's also known for a pretty decent chunk of the skeleton. We also have parts of the wing, parts of the hind limb, and part of the skull here, which is very cool because I think I mentioned in the episode we have a lot of early owl fossils, but most of them are not that complete. Like many of them are like a single bone or even just part of a single bone. So to have like this partial skeleton of such an early stem owl is really cool. And it definitely tells us a thing or two about owl evolution, at least potentially. First of all, in terms of its hind limb anatomy, it's pretty similar to modern owls, so perhaps it was using its talons fairly similarly to modern owls. That being said, where it differs from modern owls is in the skull. So the skull is not particularly complete, but there is a little bit that's particularly intriguing, and that's in the letter B here. There's this little piece of a bone here. It doesn't look too spectacular, but this is a bone that goes kind of above the eye. It's like almost like an eyebrow ridge, kind of. Now, modern owls do not have this like big eyebrow ridge bone, but diurnal raptors, raptors that feed during the day, do. So things like the hawks and eagles, for example, often have a very well developed kind of big bone there. So what this suggests is that this stem owl, which they called Yapresigox, named after the first stage of the Eocene, the Yapresian, it might have had eyes that were more similar to a diurnal raptor, in turn suggesting that this might have not been a nocturnal bird. So in that way, it was not like modern owls. So it might have been an early stem owl that branched off before nocturnality had actually evolved in the owl lineage, which is very cool because we do not know much about that transition at all. And on the next slide, speaking of diurnal owls, we have another spectacular owl fossil called Myocernia diurna. That species name there is a pretty big clue as to what the authors think was the lifestyle of this owl. So this owl is much younger than the Yapresigox. It comes from the Miocene of China. It comes from a particular formation called the Liushu Formation, which is known for spectacular bird fossils. We saw some of them back in the original series. For example, they have a fossil of a pheasant called Panrao gallus, which preserves this really long windpipe that curls up in its chest. There are also fossils of like early members of like the various vulture lineages, fossils of early falcons as well, that are all in many cases very completely preserved, and this particular owl is no exception. Like just look at that spectacular preservation. So this particular owl is called Myocernia, and now the name Cernia is actually a genus of modern owls, and that particular genus is the genus of the modern northern hawk owl, which is an owl that it lives up in the high north of both Eurasia and North America. It lives up in the boreal forests, and it is thought that Myocernia was closely related to the modern Cernia, the modern northern hawk owl. Now, the modern northern hawk owl is actually one of the few modern species of owls that is actually diurnal, so it's active during the day and not at night. And because of how completely preserved Myocernia was, the kind of bones around its eyeball were preserved. And so the authors were able to use the proportions of those bones to estimate whether this was a diurnal or nocturnal bird. And it turns out their results suggest that, like the modern northern hawk owl, Myocernia was probably diurnal. So this was another diurnal owl. Now, this is a different case from your Preseglox because your Preseglox was an early stem owl, so it had already like diverged before modern owl. The modern owl group even existed. So probably it was kind of retaining an ancestral diurnal habit. Whereas Myocernia, as a member of the crown owl group, it's an example of having reverted back to a diurnal lifestyle. So modern owls, since most of them are nocturnal, we think that probably ancestrally they were already nocturnal when they originated. But some members of the group have gone back to a diurnal habit, and it seems that the lineage leading to both Myocernia and the modern hawk owl is one of those that has done this. Do you have anything to add to these interesting owl fossils?
Well, it's an incredibly fascinating story. I agree that they're very beautiful fossils, and it's kind of neat to see that, like with even with owls, there's no shortage of behavioral pathways that can be taken.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the idea of like a day living owl is kind of weird. I mean, it just goes to show that it's not only possible, but it's happened multiple times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Alrighty then, let's continue onward. So we are going to skip over the episode on the mousebirds, trogons, and kurils, which are really cool birds. There aren't many updates to make about them, although there were a few new fossil stem kurils that were described from the Lendon Clay Formation from that same collection I mentioned earlier that came out recently. I don't think they change a lot about what I said in the episode, but it is cool to have them. However, they are sadly one of the stories that I had to cut out for time. For this episode. But let's go on to the next group, which are the picocoraciadeans. This is a group that includes things like the woodpeckers and kingfishers and various other very colorful and in many cases very ecologically unusual groups of birds. So here is I thought was an incredibly cool study. So I mentioned back in the episode when we were discussing woodpeckers that the question of how woodpeckers don't get brain damage while they're pecking at hard surfaces is actually a bit of an open question in biology. Like, this is something that we surprisingly don't understand very well, contrary to what you might have read in popular texts. And I also mentioned in the episode that people have proposed like all kinds of explanations for this. And one of the most popular explanations is that, clearly woodpeckers, there must be something about their skull structure that kind of cushions them from these blows and prevents them from getting damage while they're pecking at trees. And so people have proposed, for example, that, maybe the tongue skeleton that wraps around the skull was sort of a helmet or something like that, which for various reasons have been questioned as we discussed in the episode. And so this new study just took an approach where they looked at high-speed video of woodpeckers pecking at trees and then to try and figure out exactly what was going on during these moments of impact. And what they found was quite interesting. It turns out that, if they looked at how the bill decelerates as it hits the wood, and then compare that to how the rest of the skull decelerates as it hits the wood, it turns out that all of these parts of the skull basically all decelerate at the same, rate. The brain case is not slowed down relative to the beak. And so that suggests that the woodpecker skull is actually not absorbing shock that would go to the brain case. Like the brain case is stopping at the same rate as the beak would. Very interesting. That in some ways might seem counterintuitive, but in other ways it actually makes a lot of sense. Because first of all, if the woodpecker skull was absorbing shock while they were doing this pecking, this actually means that they would have to peck even harder to be able to achieve the same kind of pecking result that they would otherwise. Because remember Newton's third law, everything has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So if you're like reducing the blow that goes into it that travels towards you, then you're also reducing like the blow that goes into the wood. And so it actually makes more sense not to like cushion these blows in this regard. Okay, so if that's the case, well, how are woodpeckers avoiding brain injury then? Well, first of all, as I mentioned in the episode, we're actually not entirely sure that they are. We actually have found like certain kind of protein formations in their brain that in humans at least indicate brain damage. So maybe they are getting some brain damage and it's just not enough to affect their survival rate. But what does seem to be important is that they don't seem to actually be pecking at with enough force to give themselves concussions. And this is because and I mentioned this in the episode too. This has been suggested by previous studies, and according to this new study, this is probably the correct explanation. Woodpecker heads are just so much smaller than ours; they can proportionately withstand more of this force, and so basically the reason they're avoiding concussions from doing this pecking is a big part of it is that simply they are much smaller than we are, so their brain is not being like thrown around at such a high force when withstanding the same kind of impact. So the type of impact that would kind of give us a concussion might not affect a woodpecker so much. And indeed, when they kind of ran the numbers on this, they calculated like how much force were these woodpeckers actually experiencing when they were doing this pecking. It turns out they would have to like peck twice as hard to be able to give themselves an actual concussion. So yeah, basically, it might not be any kind of structural secret at all that woodpeckers are able to avoid concussions. It's simply they're just much smaller than us, and that's what's helping them. But that being said, woodpeckers do have several features in their skull that probably are adaptations towards pecking wood, but the adaptations are probably not towards reducing shock, but instead just making the skull strong enough to be able to like not break while they're doing this pecking. So it's not about absorbing the shock, but actually making the skull strong enough for this kind of behavior. So yeah, I thought this was a really cool study. It definitely overturns some popular ideas, but also confirms some ideas that people have already discussed in the past. So I was really glad to see this. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, like it's just incredibly fascinating to think that like one of the big answers to this question is just simple physics.
Yep,
You know,
exactly.
small head, small things have a little bit more durability. Ergo, you have a bird with a tiny head smacking itself against a tree.
Hmm.
It's probably not going to hurt itself as much as we would think.
Right, exactly.
That is fascinating to me. But I mean, it makes complete sense. I totally hear you there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. Let's continue onward. So we're going to skip over the episode on terror birds because unfortunately there haven't really been many terror bird studies that have come out in the last year or so, as cool as they are. So we're going to move on to the episode on the falcons and parrots. And here there's quite a bit of ground to cover. First of all, on the falcon side of things, we have yet another new specimen from the London Clay Formation, part of that same collection even. So this is a new specimen that has been named Daniels raptor. It's named after Michael Daniels, a collector of those fossils that I mentioned earlier. And this is not the complete fossil. There are other parts of the body preserved as well. In fact, there's another specimen, another individual that seems to be of the same species. That's not pictured on here. This is just a picture of the skull. But the skull can give us some very helpful clues as to what type of birds these are. And back when I did the episode, I probably mentioned Macillaraptor, which is another Eocene fossil raptor from Germany. And I probably mentioned that it is thought to be closely related to falcons, but it's hard to confirm this because the fossils of Macelloraptor are all kind of crushed flat as flattened slabs, even though they're mostly complete skeletons. So it's hard to actually see all the anatomical details in those specimens. But it's been suspected that they're closely related to falcons. And now we have Daniel's raptor, which appears to be a close relative of Macelloraptor, but its bones are preserved in more or less 3 dimensions, and so a lot more detail can be observed here. And it turns out that Daniel's raptor actually preserves quite a few features that are in common with falcons, and so they kind of strengthen this hypothesis that, that Daniel's raptor and Macelloraptor are indeed early members of the falcon lineage. That's pretty cool. Do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. Although I'm I'm loving the name though. It's like Daniel's Raptor,
Right.
which also means like Daniel's Raptor.
Right, right.
In a sense.
Exactly. And I will say, take a look at the species name too. So even though we aren't covering any new terror bird studies, this bird is actually named after the terror birds in terms of the species name. So it's Forus rhacoides, meaning similar to the Forus racids, the terror birds. And that's because in addition to having falcon-like features, the overall shape of the bill of Daniel's raptor actually does bear quite a bit of a resemblance to the terror birds. And well, as you might remember from the series, falcons and seriemas and terror birds, they are pretty close relatives, so potentially this could be something that was inherited from their common ancestor. We'll need more fossils to be able to confirm that, but that is pretty cool. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is a new study on the biogeographic history of the group Psittacopasseres. So this is a group that unites the parrots with the passeriform birds, the songbirds and their kin. So as you might recall, we discussed this in the episodes. There is a lot of good evidence that the parrots, as well as the passeriforms, originated in Australia. But that is the modern groups of the parrots and passeriforms, the crown group parrots and passeriforms, originated in those regions. But that's curious because we have Eocene fossils of birds that seem to be closely related to either the parrots or the passeriform groups. And yet those fossils, many of them come from either Europe or North America. So what's going on there? So what this study did was that they, primarily they were actually interested in biogeography of parrots specifically. So they reconstructed this phylogenetic tree of parrots and tried to estimate ancestrally where all the major parrot groups originated. And then they tried to match this up with major events in Earth history. But they also commented on these early kind of parrot and passeriform-like fossils too. And what they pointed out was that early in the Cenozoic, it would have been possible to get from Australia across Antarctica into South America. And furthermore, there were probably a series of island archipelagos in the Atlantic Ocean called Atlantogea, which might have made it easier to get from South America to Africa. And so if these early members of the parrot and passeriform lineages cross over the Atlantic Ocean this way, they would have been able to get into Europe from Africa and then from Eurasia into North America. And that could potentially explain the presence of these parrot and passeriform-like fossils in these regions. And certainly the early Eocene record of birds in, say, Africa, for example, is very poor. So that could be the reason why we haven't found fossils of them in those regions yet. I would say that seems pretty plausible. So on the biogeographic maps that you see down below, what it's showing, letter A is showing basically dispersal events that might have happened during the Paleogene based on their study, and then in letter B are dispersal events that happened in the Neogene based on their study. And the solid lines are members of crown group passeriforms and parrots, their dispersal events. And in the dotted line, you can see is the proposed dispersal route of these stem group passeriforms and stem group parrots, and also probably stem group psittacopasserians as well, as we discussed in the episode. However, like probably the modern groups of passeriforms, certainly the modern group of parrots probably originated much later in the late Eocene, and so by then it was probably not so easy to get across Antarctica anymore, and so they would have had a different dispersal route out of Australia, probably via the Indo-Malayan islands. And this actually differs a little bit from the biogeographic model I discussed about parrots in the episode. So they mentioned, I mentioned that it was previously hypothesized that, for example, some parrots got to Africa by going across Antarctica and spreading northward. But the authors of this study argue that there probably wasn't a very easy dispersal route between Antarctica and Africa by then, and so it's more likely that those parrots got into Africa through Eurasia instead. So yeah, a little bit of a revision there. Something I'll draw attention to is that they estimate the parrot and passeriform group as being quite old. They actually estimate them as potentially having originated even in the latest Cretaceous, which, as I've discussed on the show, I'm pretty skeptical of. And certainly the error bars on these, they are like wide enough that you could say that this group originated like later in the Cenozoic. So I would not read too much into that, is what I'm going to say about that. However, I do think the biogeographic model makes a decent amount of sense. Do you have anything to add to this?
I'm really fascinated by this paper. I'll just say for now, I guess I have a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn about biogeography. I did not know we had names for a lot of these different land masses. Like I had heard about the ideas about island hopping between South America and Africa in regards to the Platyrrhines. But I didn't know that we had a name for that.
Right.
Atlantogea. That's interesting. But yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of nice to see this kind of biogeographical history of parrots and passerines, like refined quite a bit. That's really cool. I'll have to dig deeper into this paper some more.
Yeah. As always, we will be putting links to all these papers in the description, so anyone who's interested will be able to check them out. Let's go on to the next slide. So yeah, we had quite a lengthy discussion about avian intelligence and cognition in the parrot episode, and so as always, this is a hot topic of study, and so there are several new studies I would like to discuss related to this subject. So there were a few more examples of kind of interesting complex cognition observed in parrots that came out in the last year or so. So one of these was an experiment where they tested these Tannenbar corellas. I mentioned this species several times in discussing avian intelligence. This is a species that is known to use tools. This experiment wanted to test if Tannenbar corellas were able to kind of use multiple tools in conjunction with each other, or like multiple tools like one after another to achieve a certain result. And so what they did was they first showed these parrots a particular setup. So this is the setup on the left here under the letter A. There are these platforms where the researchers put food on these gray platforms you can see on either side of this apparatus. And then there's a hole on top on either side where the parrots could drop a ball down inside, and then when the ball hits the platform collapses and the food comes out of the bottom, and so the parrots can eat it then. And so they first exposed the parrots to this particular setup to let them know, okay, so if you drop a ball onto the platform, you will get food. Okay, sounds good enough. Then they decided to give them a modified apparatus, and so this is a very similar setup on the right here, except this time the parrots first had to insert the ball into through this wire mesh essentially, and then because the parrots would not be able to like get their head or their feet inside the wire mesh, they would have to use a stick to kind of push the ball so that it falls onto the collapsible platform. And I think some of the news articles basically called this like parrots playing golf or something. which yeah, which I mean, kind of yeah. This is a pretty complex problem. Like first they had to be able to insert the ball into the wire mesh through the hole there, and then they had to be able to figure out how to use a stick to move the ball into the hole. And it turns out that some of them did. At least 5 of the 11 parrots that they tested, if my memory serves, were able to figure out how to kind of solve this problem. And what's interesting is that each individual had a slightly different way of using the stick. Like they would hold the stick at different points, for example. Like the idea is that you would like insert the stick at points like to either side of the big hole. As you can see here, you can see that there's this gap that runs along the entire side, and then you would be able to like move the ball along those gaps, right? But some of the parrots, they instead of inserting the stick through those spaces, they continue to try and insert it into like the hole in the middle. But I mean, some of the times that worked anyway. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see the individual variation, but it certainly shows like very complex problem-solving capabilities in these birds. And of course, we were aware of that, but not necessarily for this particular problem specifically. And on the right there is showing cockatoos in the wild opening trash bins. We talked about this story, not this particular story, but a kind of sort of prequel study to this in the last update special, where people have observed that cockatoos are learning to open bins to like feed on the trash inside, basically. So this study is kind of a follow-up to that, where they found that it seems like the cockatoos and the human residents, where the cockatoos are doing this, might be engaged in a bit of an arms race. They interviewed like the people in these areas to see like how are they preventing cockatoos from like going into their trash, and they found like a variety of strategies. So for example, some people put like a fake snake on the trash bin to try and scare the cockatoos away. Some people put something heavy on the trash bins to try and prevent the cockatoos from getting in. Some people like put inserted shoes into the hinge of the lid so that they couldn't be opened. And some people like actually tied like heavy objects onto the bin, not just like putting it directly on top. It turned out that this kind of escalation of like increasingly hard to get into methods of protecting the trash bins seem to correlate with the cockatoos being able to figure out how to get around them, basically. So, like, for example, the snake thing, I don't think I went into much detail in the paper, but I imagine the snake thing probably didn't work for a very long time. And simply putting heavy objects without tying them down, the cockatoos were able to figure that out and kind of knock the objects off of the lid and then open it from there. So far, according to the paper, the cockatoos had not yet figured out how to get around, like, putting stuff in the hinge or, like, putting stuff that is tied on top of the lid, but we'll see. It's interesting that a lot of these responses from the humans seem to be in response to the cockatoos being able to figure out how to get around these kind of protection measures. So the author suggests that this is sort of a cultural arms race where the cockatoos are learning how to get into the bins and the humans are kind of having to devise new methods of kind of preventing them from doing this. And the humans certainly are learning from each other because the authors interviewed the people and they said that, oh yeah, like I learned to use this trick from my neighbors or something like that to prevent the cockatoos from getting into the bin. So they call it a cultural arms race because like this information is being transmitted culturally. Interesting little bit of a human and a smart bird intelligence there. Do you have anything to add to these studies?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's an amazing study. Pretty soon we'll be talking about the cockatoo war, like
right.
War, it seems.
Exactly.
That's too funny. I really like the first study too.
Mm-hmm.
What a great setup for an experiment. I mean, I'd love to see like video footage of this if that's available.
Yeah. I think there are supplemental videos that come with the paper. So if you go to the paper, you should be able to look at them. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. That's great. It's always wonderful to see stuff like this. That's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, these are just a selection of the new papers on the subject that have come out. I know there are others, but again, interest of time, so I picked a few that I thought were especially interesting. But there's loads of work being done on the subject. And on that note, there have also been lots of work done on not just how birds express their intelligence, but what controls their intelligence in the first place. People have argued, is it absolute brain size, like the actual size of the brain, or relative brain size that determines how smart an animal is, like the size of the brain relative to its body size. And so a new study investigated this in birds, and it turns out that in birds, their results suggest both absolute and relative brain size are linked to bird cognition, specifically what they call innovation. And so basically birds being able to come up with new behaviors to exploit new food sources. And so what they did was that they documented how many neurons are in the brain of all these different types of birds, and then kind of lined that up with how innovative they are based on prior observations. How often do they exhibit innovative behaviors? And it turns out that according to the results, both absolute and relative brain size are linked in birds to innovative behaviors. And there is at least a pretty good explanation for this. And so this particular figure actually sort of depicts the theory of how both of these came to be correlated with avian cognition. So starting at the top left, you can see that, if you have more neurons, you can be smarter, basically. Okay, so one way to get more neurons would be to make the problem-solving part of your brain bigger. And so you get to the letter B on the top right. So you get more neurons for your body size, and that could make you smarter relative to the ancestral state. Cool. So that gives you a larger relative brain size. But then, if you have a larger relative brain size, you can get even more neurons by becoming absolutely bigger, by becoming bigger in body size, and your brain size grows with it. And so that's the lower left. And so then you get absolute brain size correlated with your cognitive performance. And then finally, the last part is not directly kind of tied to the brain size problem, but it also means it also shows that there's a correlation between kind of how long it takes for you to grow after you hatch. So if you have a large absolute brain, it's going to take longer for your young to develop. And so it turns out that having larger brains also correlates with kind of longer childhoods in birds, essentially, which is also kind of what we see in primates too, isn't it? So yeah, this is a pretty interesting study. Now you might think, that's obvious, right? Of course, both relative and absolute brain size are linked to intelligence when you put it that way. But it's not actually that simple, because as we'll see on the next slide, so there was a new study that decided to estimate neuron numbers in not just birds, but also across all of amniotes, so also in non-bird reptiles and also in mammals, and compared them to each other. And so this is a pretty interesting study, because what they found was that there are major increases in the number of neurons in birds and in mammals independently. And then particularly in birds, there's an increase in the teleravians, core land birds, as they put it here, which is a group of birds that includes the most cognitively complex birds, the parrots and the corvids. And also in the mammals independently, there's also a major increase in neuron number in the primates, so our group. So that's really cool. So these kind of parallel evolutions here. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is, first of all, I mentioned previously that a previous study had concluded that bird brains are able to pack in a lot more neurons than most mammal brains can. So they have a higher density of neurons in the brain, which means that a bird can have a smaller brain than a mammal, but still be just as smart because they are able to densely pack those neurons inside the brain. And so because this study sampled a greater number of bird species and a more diverse range of bird species than that previous one, they were able to show that this particularly dense packing of the neurons is especially true of the parrots and the songbirds, which of course are the groups where we see the most complex cognitive abilities. And so that definitely lines up pretty well. So anyway, what was I mentioning about the role of relative brain size here? Well, it turns out that um, this study found that neuron number does not always correlate with relative brain size, interestingly enough. So it does in birds and it does in non-bird reptiles, but does not always correlate with relative brain size in mammals. So it turns out that the relative brain size of a mammal is not always a great indicator of cognitive complexity. But there is one group of mammals where it does hold, and that's the primates. So yeah, it just so happens that the group that we belong to and are most familiar with are the group where brain size, like relative brain size, is a correlate of neuron number. But that is not true across like mammals in general. So yeah, it turns out that relative brain size is misleading in some instances, and why that's the case, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know, but this is certainly not my field of study. Um, but it's definitely interesting to see how these patterns differ between different groups of amniotes. Um, and on the right here, it's a different study showing the amount of energy that's required to fuel the neurons of different animals. Because after all, if birds can pack in neurons much more densely than we can, like how do they do this? Like, doesn't that require a lot of energy to fuel so many neurons? Um, well, this new study looked at neuron kind of glucose consumption in the neurons of pigeons. So basically, how much sugar do the neurons of birds need? And they found that it turns out for the amount of neurons that they have, uh, pigeons at least need a lot fewer, a lot less energy than mammal brains do. Um, and you can see that here. So the y-axis is basically the amount of energy required to fuel the neurons, and the x-axis is the neuron density. And so pigeons have very high neuron density, but not much of an energy requirement for those neurons. Whereas in mammals, when you have really high neuron density, like you have a spectacular kind of energy requirement to sustain that. So that kind of gives us another clue as to how birds are able to be so smart despite having such absolutely small brains. Do you have anything to add to these studies?
Well, I'll admit it's also like not my area of expertise, but like just kind of hearing you describe these studies, um, that is fascinating to see, especially like the study on the right with the pigeon.
Mm-hmm.
I did not expect that, to be
Yeah.
completely honest. I thought there would be like a little bit more mammalian similarities, but it kind of just goes to show like the importance of convergence versus divergence in groups that are so far apart from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Like different ways of being smart, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty then. Let's continue onward. All right, so we're in the final phase now. We got to the final episode, the episode on passeriforms. And so first up here is a study on the comparative anatomy of the passeriform carpometacarpus. What does that mean? Well, the carpometacarpus is one of the bones in the wing. It's composed of the wrist bones and the bones of the palm that have all been fused together into a single bone. So it's called, carpometacarpus. Carpals being the wrist bones, metacarpals being the palm bones. So essentially, these are bones of the hand in birds. Uh, I sort of alluded to this work back when I did the episode because the lead author on this work is one of my lab mates, Lizzie Steele, who is doing her PhD on the evolution of passeriforms. And so I mentioned this previously in the main series, but there has been like this traditional conception that um, all passeriform skeletons look the same. So if you have like two different passeriform species and look at their skeletons, they're all basically identical, and you can't really get much useful information out of that. Um, Lizzie has been looking at a lot of different passeriform skeletons for her PhD, and it turns out that is not actually true at all. And so she, in this paper, she focused on looking at just the carpometacarpus of passeriforms, and she found that there are like all these different characteristic features that distinguish the different groups of passeriforms in just this single bone alone. And so this is a really cool study because we really need detailed descriptions of passeriform bones because hardly anyone has done that. And not only that, but based on the information that she got from looking at modern passeriform carpometacarpi, she was also able to say a few things about where some various fossil passeriforms might fall in the phylogenetic tree. And you can see that in the figure on the right here. The various dark circles and squares, the lineages with those are all fossil taxa or fossil specimens. And previously, it's been pretty difficult to figure out what some of these fossils are. But based on her work on carpometacarpal anatomy, at least, it seems that many of these fossils are representatives of the crown group Subausines and the crown group Aucenes. Remember, these are two of the major groups within Passeriformes. The Aucenes are basically equivalent to the songbirds. Last but not least, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. If you look at the little icons of birds on here, they might look familiar. I drew them. Lizzie did ask me like if she could use them, and I said yes. So yeah, that's a story there. I think this might be the first scientific paper that my drawings have actually appeared in, so that's kind of neat. But anyways, like I was only a minor contributor to this study. I'm not even really one of the co-authors. This is all like Lizzie's work, and she's definitely she definitely has a lot more cool stuff to come. So yeah, finally good to have like a nice detailed study on Passeriform skeletal anatomy. Do you have anything to add before we go on?
Yeah, I'm very happy for her. Like, this is fantastic. And yeah, I agree that it certainly would go a long way to helping with a lot of these fossils, especially as mysterious as a lot of them are. And also, like, I'm pretty happy for you too. I'm glad you were able to kind of have that milestone in on your belt. I've been kind of noticing too a lot of papers I've been seeing, even in this episode. They've also been kind of like going back to like the old archives of wildlife art and getting like silhouette or like full color images of certain species that they need for their paper from like vintage like 18th century 19th century kind of art.
Yeah.
And it's like that's kind of cool to see. It's like it's kind of gone full circle a little bit.
That's true. That's a very good observation. All right. So the next one is about how nest architecture is linked to the ecology of songbirds. Because I mentioned in the episode that passeriform birds are known for having like very complex nests. Like a lot of time they're like very finely woven, composed of like these really fine materials that have to be like kind of all woven together in a very specific way. And the kind of standard bird nest that we think of when we think of a bird nest, like a cup-shaped nest that's sitting in a tree, like that's primarily something that passeriform birds specifically do. Like that's not something that any bird can do. So this particular study wanted to look at how nest architecture influences like ecological success in songbirds, because they have all these like different types of complex nests too. So some types of songbirds, they build what are called like covered nests. So it might be a dome or a ball-shaped nest with an entrance on the side or on the bottom. But other ones make like a cup-like nest, like I kind of mentioned earlier. And some passeriforms actually nest in tree holes instead of putting their nest in a tree, or like instead of putting their nest on top of a tree branch or on the ground. Okay, so what they did was basically they documented different types of nests built by different types of songbirds, and then they calculated like how widely distributed are these different types of birds. Like, do they have a very large geographic range or not? Like, do they tolerate a wide range of habitats, or are they restricted to some very narrow set of conditions? And what they found was that songbirds that build cup-shaped nests and those that live in tree hollows or nest in tree hollows at least tend to have wider distributions than those that build covered nests. So that's a pretty interesting pattern. It suggests that having these particular types of nests might indeed influence kind of ecological success. Now, why might this be? Well, there are a few different ideas that have been proposed. One seems to be that a covered nest takes a lot more time to build, and you can imagine that, right? You need more materials to make a covered nest compared to an equivalently sized cup nest. So yeah, that could well be an influence, like how much time you spent building your nest. That could also affect like how many chances you get to breed in the season. It's interesting to see that there is this kind of correlation between nest type and ecological success. Okay, so I guess the question then is, so what are some benefits of the covered nest? And well, that's something that the study does not really cover. Kind of beyond the scope of the study, as we researchers would say. So I think that that's still something that remains to be figured out, perhaps. So we know that clearly cup nests and nesting in tree hollows has some advantages. So why have so many songbirds and other passeriforms still retained, or evolved like the building of cup nests? That still sounds like an open question, but it is a pretty cool approach to studying like the evolution of this group of birds. Anything to add before we move on?
I really like this study. Kind of giving me vibes of the um, broken wing display
Oh
study
yeah,
that we
yeah,
talked about
yeah.
on one of our last news episodes. So it's kind of cool to see that done with passerine nesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's really fascinating. I have to. This is another one I'd definitely love to kind of dig into a little bit more and read about.
Definitely. Well, it'll be linked in the description like all the others. Okay, we are very close to the end now. So at the end of our last episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, I went into a bit of detail looking at bird conservation and some of the major threats that birds face. And well, that's certainly still an ongoing concern. And so many notable studies on the subject have come out within the last year or so. So I just wanted to like very briefly share some of these. So in the top left is a graph from a big review paper. It's called something like "The State of the World's Birds," and it's a huge review paper. Like I think if you want to know like the current status of like bird conservation, I think you should just go straight to that paper because it's immensely detailed and covers a lot of ground, talking about just the threats that birds face, kind of conservation efforts that have been done to try and mitigate these losses of bird species, and what works and what doesn't, like success stories. I think it looks like a really thorough review paper, and so if you want to understand bird conservation and the current state of like dangers birds face from human activity right now, I think that's an excellent paper to go to. And then there are also some papers that looked at the kind of more specific aspects of birds being at risk of extinction. So, for example, in the middle of the top row here was a paper looking at basically what we stand to lose if we lose the birds that are most at risk of extinction. And so what they did was they looked at what birds are most, what we say, phylogenetically distinctive versus their current like risk of extinction. And so phylogenetic distinctiveness basically measures, does this bird have any close living relatives, or has it been like sort of an isolated branch for a long time? And if it is like very distinct in terms of its phylogenetic position, then well, potentially it's a big loss to us if we lose it, right? Because that means that's like the entirety of a lineage, of a lineage that's been around for a long time that just disappears. And also, if they're phylogenetically distinctive, it is likely that they occupy a very distinct position in their ecosystems, right? So if we lose them, then it's going to be very hard to kind of replace like whatever ecological niche that they were occupying previously. So basically, that's kind of what this study was investigating. And it turns out that they were able to confirm that, yeah, basically, if we lose the most threatened species of birds today, we're going to lose some pretty major phylogenetic diversity from modern birds. We stand to lose like quite a lot. And in fact, there was another study, I haven't pictured it on here, which kind of approached this very similarly, but they looked at not phylogenetic diversity, but functional diversity, like how birds operate, like, or at least correlates of how birds operate, like the length of the beak or the length of the wings and such. So birds that occupy very distinct functional space are also doing things that are like other birds aren't necessarily doing. And so if we lose those, then we lose a big kind of ecological kind of component. And similarly, they also found that the most threatened birds, if we lose them, then we also stand to lose a lot of functional diversity that can't be easily replaced by the surviving bird species. The signal that it's ever more important to conserve a lot of these very threatened bird species and make sure that we don't lose any more of them. And On the top right here was a study looking at kind of color diversity in songbirds specifically. So I think I mentioned this in the episode, but a lot of tropical birds are under threat from illegal pet trade. They're being caught in like unsustainable numbers from the wild because people like to keep these birds in cages because they look nice or sound nice. And so what they did was that they documented like kind of the diversity and distinctiveness of the color patterns in all these different tropical bird species, or all these different bird species from around the world. And they found that, yeah, in the tropics is where you find, not only where you find the most color diversity, but also colorful birds are the ones that are most threatened by this kind of unsustainable pet trade. And so that's not only bad news for the birds, because a lot of these countries with high biodiversity kind of have a very well developed ecotourism industry. Like people come from all around the world to see like the unique natural sights and wildlife of many of these places. But if we lose a lot of these distinctively colored birds, then they lose a really major component of like what there is to see when it comes to like ecotourism. So yeah, like if this kind of illegal trade continues, we could be losing a lot of very distinctive bird species, as well as a major source of revenue for the local people who live alongside these birds. So that's basically the main takeaway of this study, and it suggests that we should be putting a lot of like conservation attention on a lot of these tropical, brightly colored songbird species. And finally, on the bottom was a study looking at how climate change is likely to affect birds in the future. And I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but long story short is that we're probably gonna lose a lot of bird species through climate change. And there will be some areas where birds will kind of move into because it becomes a more suitable habitat for them. And so in that way, some regions might see increases in bird species, but by far we're going to see much bigger net loss of species and gain. And so, yeah, climate change is bad news, but you already knew that. So just a few of the, it might be wrong to call these highlights, but few of the notable and I would say pretty important studies that have been done on bird conservation in the last year or so. Do you have anything to add to this?
Oh, I mean, you certainly got the point across very well. It's definitely a rough situation. And it's like with every one of these sorts of studies, and we get a little bit clear picture of what is going on and what we could expect if things continue as they do on their own.
Right.
Yeah, it's not looking good. But it's good to know that, I mean, at least we have studies like this that we can at least put our finger on a piece of paper and say, okay, this is where, this is where we are, this is where we should be.
Right.
And we can actually, talk about solutions as, we've tried to give at least in this series to what we can do to remedy a lot of the situation, mitigate it, But yeah, I certainly hope that there's more positive change to come.
Yeah, I would agree. Alrighty then. So let's go on to the next slide. And so at the end of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, the main series, I provided a list of all the newly named bird species that had come out since I started doing this series. I mean, more species have been named since we completed the series, and so I decided to list them here. And you might notice some familiar names because we covered a few of these in this episode right here. And so, yeah, basically, new discoveries are still being made all the time. We're still finding plenty of fossil bird species and even some new living bird species as well. So, yeah, science marches on. And I'm sure like the next time I do an update of the series, we'll be seeing many more new names as well. Anything to add before we conclude?
This is kind of giving me Daranash Tetsu year in review vibes, to be completely honest. It's like, okay, we're doing it with Teleraves and galloanserans. Gotta work on gruiforms a little bit and the other ones.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you can see that Teleravians are by far like the most represented in these new discoveries, but that's not really a surprise, right? Because Teleravians are by far like a massive proportion, the majority of birds that are around today. So it stands to reason that they we would be we would find many more representatives of them than of the other groups.
Oh, of course, of course. I'm loving some of these though. Some of these names. I like this one right here, Psittacomimus.
Yes.
That's a new one.
Oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, parrot mimic. Yeah, yeah. So that unfortunately was one of the studies I had to cut out. But that is yet another new species from the London Clay Formation. Yes, same collection. So that is a new species of psittacopedid. Now you might recall, if you have a good memory, psittacopedids are a group of we currently think they are stem group passeriforms. But they have zygodactyl feet, so 2 toes pointing forward and 2 toes pointing backward, similar to parrots. For a long time, it was thought that psittacopedids were stem parrots, but we have many more fossils of them now, including Psittacomimus, and it seems more likely they are actually on the passerine side of the family tree. So that's pretty neat. It's always cool to get more representatives of these early extinct groups of birds.
Absolutely, I agree.
Alrighty then. So let's move onward. And we are in our ending matter now. If you enjoyed this episode or this series, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your contributions will help us continue this series and develop new projects and expansions, and perhaps even release episodes more frequently. Yeah, so I believe we have 4 patrons. It's been a while since I've done this that require a shout out. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So let's see: Joan's sister Julie, our patron Paul, and our friends Ilari and Denver. We appreciate your contributions all very much, and so we hope to see more of you there. All right. Next slide. As always, our friend Henry did the theme music for our show, and our friend Alicia designed the color scheme for my avatar that you see here, and so they make valuable contributions to every episode of our show. Finally, if you're interested in keeping up with us, you can follow us on Twitter or directly on our YouTube channel, where you will be able to see whenever we release a new episode. If you have questions about the show, you can leave a comment or send them to our email at timeandclades@gmail.com. And I know we haven't been checking the email account very often in the last month or so. Sorry if you have sent us anything there, but yeah, we will try to get back to you when possible. And since this is a very paper-heavy episode, a very reference-heavy episode, if you are interested at all in any of the studies that we discussed in this episode, please see the description for links to them, and as well to other topics that we discussed. And yeah, I think that's really it for now. Okay, so as for next time, well, I would say holiday season is kind of creeping up on us now. And I would say both of us probably have plans for the holidays and might not have much time to record new episodes for perhaps the rest of this month, which by extension means the rest of the year. So we may or may not release another episode this year. So if we don't, we hope that everyone else listening to this has a great holiday season and a happy new year. If we do, then, well, it'll be a nice surprise. Certainly, it's been a while since we've done a news episode, so it is possible that we might squeeze some time in for one, but I'm not going to make any promises at this stage. How about you?
Oh yeah, for sure as well. I don't mean to pull a George R.R. Martin on all of y'all, but I am working on the special episode. It is coming. It's just, life stuff and that sort of thing kind of gets in the way. But yeah, I cannot promise anything. But who knows? Maybe if I get the right time and the right burst of creativity, I'll be able to jump back on that. And it would be a similar episode like my review of the memoirs of Cleopatra. So it would be an episode run by me solely. So, but like other than that, I can't really give too many more details on that. Still want to keep it a bit of a surprise. Yeah. But yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a while since we did a news episode, but I think we'll figure something out in the future, and we'll get back to y'all on that. But we certainly hope that you all have a wonderful rest of December, however you celebrate, and we always appreciate y'all's support and your help in making this series what it is today. So we appreciate it very much, and we're glad that y'all could come along with us.
Seconded for sure. So yeah, please take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time, whenever that is.
Y'all take care.